The desert wind howled softly across the Khyber Pass, carrying with it the scent of dust, diesel, and danger. In the faint moonlight, a convoy of trucks wound its way through the winding roads, their engines humming like distant thunder. The men driving them were silent, eyes fixed ahead, hands gripping their steering wheels as though holding on to fate itself. Hidden beneath tarps and crates were the treasures of an empire, hashish, gold, weapons, and the weight of a secret world that few outside these mountains would ever truly understand. At the heart of this shadow network stood one name whispered with reverence and fear alike, Haji Ayyub Afridi. To outsiders, he was an enigma, a smuggler, a politician, a tribal elder, and a legend. But to those who knew the land, he was something far more complicated. He was a man who moved like smoke through borders, untouched by laws and unbound by loyalties. Born in a world defined by ancient codes of honor and shifting modern alliances, Haji Ayyub mastered both. In the tribal regions between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where government struggled to assert control, Ayyub's word carried more weight than any decree from Islamabad. He could command an army without raising his voice. He could move mountains of contraband with a single phone call. Yet, despite his power, he remained an enigma, a man of prayer, family, and a curious calm that only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Imagine him now, sitting cross-legged on a woven rug inside a dimly lit hujra, the traditional Pashtun gathering place. A brass samovar hissed quietly beside him, filling the air with the smell of strong tea. His face was weathered by the desert sun, his beard trimmed neatly, his eyes sharp but weary. Men came and went, smugglers, politicians, military officers, and tribal chiefs, each seeking his counsel, his blessing, or his favor. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, he looked more like a scholar than a kingpin, more like a statesman than a criminal. But beneath the surface of his composure lay the instincts of a survivor, honed by decades of navigating danger. The story of Haji Ayyub Afridi is not simply that of a man who broke the law. It is the story of a man who understood the law of his land, the unspoken rules of the frontier. To live in the tribal belt meant living outside of conventional order. For centuries, these mountains had defied empires, British, Soviet, American alike. Governments rose and fell, but the tribes remained, proud and untamed. In this world, smuggling was not merely a crime, it was commerce, survival, even tradition. Ayyub's genius was not in creating this trade, but in mastering it. He elevated smuggling into an organized, multinational business. What others saw as lawlessness, he saw as opportunity. As the world beyond the Khyber shifted, first with the collapse of colonial rule, then with the rise of new global markets, Ayyub watched and adapted. He learned the language of businessmen as easily as he spoke the dialects of tribes. He understood that power was not only in guns and gold, but in information and alliances. By the time Pakistan and Afghanistan began to feel the tremors of the Cold War, Ayyub had already built a network that could move anything, from carpets to cash, from weapons to narcotics, across mountains and borders without detection. And when the winds of politics began to blow in his direction, he knew exactly how to bend with them. Yet, despite the wealth and notoriety, there was a strange quiet to his life. He never built mansions in foreign cities, never flaunted his riches. Those who met him described a man of discipline, almost ascetic in nature. He prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, and often spoke about destiny. He did not drink or gamble. Even his enemies admitted that Ayyub Afridi had a kind of moral code, however paradoxical it seemed. He was both devout and defiant, a man who believed deeply in God while simultaneously defying every human law written around him. The image of the Hashish king ruling from the mountain sounds almost mythical, and perhaps that's part of why his story endures. Like all great figures of the underworld, his legend exists between truth and rumor. Some say he was protected by Pakistan's intelligence agencies. Others claim he was used by the CIA during the Soviet-Afghan War. Still others insist he was simply smarter than everyone who tried to stop him. What is certain, however, is that his empire thrived at a time when the line between patriotism and profiteering blurred beyond recognition. In a world fractured by politics and poverty, Ayyub found a way to stand at the crossroads of both. To understand Haji Ayyub Afridi is to understand the strange intersection of morality and survival that defines life on the frontier. He did not see himself as a villain. In his mind, he was a man of his people, a provider, a negotiator, a protector. The governments in faraway capitals offered little to the tribes of the Khyber. There were no factories, no banks, no opportunities. So, men like Ayyub built their own systems, their own economies. The world might have called it the drug trade. But to him and those around him, it was simply business, one that fed families, paid debts, and maintained tribal honor. As the years passed, stories of his cunning became the stuff of folklore. Smugglers spoke of his ability to predict raids before they happened. Rivals told of deals struck with a single nod. Even government officers, hardened and skeptical, admitted privately that without Ayyub, the entire border economy would collapse. Yet, beneath the admiration was fear, a quiet understanding that power of his kind could never last forever. Every empire, even one built in the shadows, must someday face the light. The night deepens over the Khyber, and the trucks continue their crawl across the desert road. Their cargo will soon reach the cities, where new hands will take over, and the profits will disappear into invisible accounts. But somewhere, far away, a man like Ayyub Afridi sits in silence, sipping tea, his mind already on the next move. He has played this game longer than anyone else. He knows that in the world he built, there are no permanent friends, no lasting enemies, only shifting sands and fleeting fortunes. And though the mountains may keep their secrets, his story, like the smoke from those endless convoys, rises into the night, tracing the outline of a life lived in defiance of every border drawn by man. The desert whispers his name even now, part myth, part memory, part warning. For in the end, Haji Ayyub Afridi was more than a smuggler. He was the embodiment of the frontier itself, untamed, mysterious, and forever caught between two worlds, the lawful and the lawless, the sacred and the profane. The land that shaped Haji Ayyub Afridi was as unforgiving as it was majestic. The rugged mountains of the Khyber Pass stood like ancient sentinels, guarding the threshold between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Here, the wind carried not just sand, but stories, of warriors and wanderers, of traders and kings. The valleys echoed with the rhythm of a people whose lives were bound by tradition, faith, and survival. In this austere landscape, where the earth itself seemed to resist submission, a young Ayyub took his first steps into a world defined by honor and hardship. Landi Kotal, his birthplace, was no ordinary town. It was a frontier bazaar where the ancient and the modern met awkwardly, where caravans from Central Asia brushed shoulders with traders from Karachi and Dubai. Donkeys carried loads of salt and cloth alongside roaring Bedford trucks overloaded with smuggled goods. The scent of diesel mixed with dust, gun oil, and roasted lamb. At night, fires flickered across the hills, where men gathered under open skies, sipping tea and talking in low voices about business, blood, and destiny. This was not a world of clear laws, it was a world of balance. Every action demanded a counteraction, every favor came with a debt. Among the Pashtun, the tribal code of Pashtunwali reigned supreme: honor, hospitality, revenge, and loyalty. It was both moral compass and social contract. Ayyub's early years were spent among men who valued courage above wealth and word above law. His family, like many in the Afridi tribe, had lived for generations along these ancient routes. They were known as traders, neither rich nor poor, but respected. From his father, Ayyub learned the art of negotiation, the importance of keeping promises, and the subtle power of silence. From his elders, he absorbed the wisdom that survival on the frontier was not about brute strength, but about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to simply wait. It was in these lessons that the seeds of his future empire were quietly planted. The young Ayyub was observant. He would often sit by the roadside and watch convoys move in and out of the valley, each one carrying stories from beyond the mountains. There was something mesmerizing about the movement of goods and gold, of men who spoke different languages but shared a common purpose. He understood, even as a boy, that the Khyber was not merely a passage of stone, it was a living artery, pulsing with trade, secrets, and opportunity. Long before he touched the world of narcotics or politics, Ayub saw the invisible economy that thrived in the shadows of legality. He realized that whoever controlled this flow of goods would control more than just money, they would control power itself. But life in the frontier was far from romantic. Poverty was a constant companion, and opportunities were scarce. The mountains, beautiful as they were, gave little back. Families relied on trade, smuggling, or labor across the border. The young Ayub, like many boys his age, dreamed of something larger, something beyond the small stalls of Landi Kotal's bazaar. He would hear tales of rich merchants in Peshawar, of men who rose from nothing to command fleets of trucks and caravans. Each story fueled his ambition, but also deepened his understanding that power came only to those who dared to cross lines others feared to approach. The tribal society around him was deeply structured yet fluid in its own way. Elders resolved disputes in jirgas, councils where justice was swift but rarely written. Guns hung on walls not as threats, but as symbols of readiness. Religion, too, was woven seamlessly into daily life. Prayers were called from small mosques built of mud and stone, their echoes bouncing off the cliffs. Yet alongside this deep faith was a pragmatic acceptance of the world's complexity. Men would pray at dawn and negotiate illegal shipments by dusk. Morality was not black or white, it was a spectrum shaped by necessity. As Ayub grew, so did his understanding of this delicate moral balance. He saw his uncles and neighbors navigate deals that blurred the line between legal trade and contraband. Radios, cloth, watches, and sometimes even guns flowed through their hands, feeding a vast network that stretched from Karachi's port to Kabul's markets. The government's reach here was weak, almost symbolic. Taxes were seldom collected, and officials who ventured too far into the hills often did not return. In such an environment, it was only natural that the people learned to govern themselves. Authority belonged not to the state, but to those who could command respect, and enforce it when necessary. Ayub's family was known for its integrity. Even among smugglers, their word was their bond. When disputes arose, his father was often called to mediate, trusted for his fairness and composure. The young Ayub observed these meetings closely, the pauses, the gestures, the careful choice of words that could turn hostility into peace or friendship into enmity. These observations would later shape his own dealings, where diplomacy often achieved what violence could not. He was learning, quietly and efficiently, the language of power. The borderlands themselves seemed to whisper lessons to those who listened. The rugged hills taught patience. The sudden storms taught caution. The endless movement of traders taught adaptability. By the time Ayub reached his teenage years, he had developed a calmness beyond his age. He spoke little, but when he did, others listened. He worked alongside his father, helping manage goods and accounts, and slowly began to form his own small ventures, moving items across informal routes, negotiating with drivers, keeping records. What began as modest participation in family trade would soon become his first steps toward an empire. But fate, as it often does, had larger plans. The world beyond Khyber was changing rapidly. Pakistan, still a young nation, was struggling to define its borders and its identity. Afghanistan, on the other side, teetered between monarchies and revolutions. The old caravan routes that had existed for centuries were now watched by soldiers, customs officers, and intelligence agents. Yet even as governments tried to impose control, trade continued, because need could not be legislated away. In this constant tension between law and survival, Ayub found his calling. He learned to navigate people as others navigated terrain. Where others saw borders, he saw bridges. He became known for his reliability, his ability to deliver what he promised, no matter how difficult the route or how dangerous the deal. By the time he was in his 20s, whispers had already begun to circulate. There was a young Afridi who could move anything across the mountains, and no one could stop him. He was still small compared to the powerful traders of the time, but those who met him sensed something different. His ambition was quiet, but it burned steadily, like an ember waiting for wind. The social and political fabric of the tribal belt was also beginning to shift. New roads were being built, linking the frontier more directly with urban centers. Money from the Gulf began flowing in, changing lifestyles and aspirations. For some, it was a chance to rise; for others, it brought new rivalries. In the midst of this change, Ayoub's understanding of the world deepened. He realized that the frontier's true strength lay not in isolation but in connection. The same routes that brought cloth and sugar could one day carry things far more valuable, and far more dangerous. Each night, as the sun disappeared behind the jagged hills, the young Ayoub would watch the horizon glow with the last light. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay opportunities untapped, fortunes unmade. He didn't yet know how, but he was certain of one thing: he would not spend his life as a small trader in Landi Kotal. He would build something larger, something that would make even the most powerful men of the plains speak his name with both respect and caution. The land had given him everything he needed: patience, cunning, and a code. The rest, he would take. And as the wind swept through the passes that had carried countless armies and empires before him, it seemed to whisper a promise to the young man from Khyber, that one day, the world would know the name Haji Ayoub Afridi. The first steps into the underworld are never taken with a roar; they begin in silence, in necessity, in the quiet understanding that survival often means crossing lines others fear to approach. For Haji Ayoub Afridi, that realization came slowly, shaped not by greed, but by the realities of frontier life. The 1960s were years of tension and transformation across Pakistan's tribal belt. Governments in faraway cities made promises that never reached the mountains. Roads were built, but justice rarely traveled them. In Landi Kotal, opportunity came not from the state, but from what could be moved, and how cleverly it could disappear. Ayoub had already earned a reputation as a dependable trader by his late 20s. He dealt in simple things at first: dry fruits, textiles, sugar, spare parts. The trucks he managed wound through the jagged roads, their loads declared one thing, their hidden compartments carrying another. Contraband was not seen as a crime here; it was a necessity. Taxes were high, customs were corrupt, and families needed food. Every household had someone who worked in the trade. For Ayoub, it began as an extension of his father's business: a few shipments here, a few deals there. But he was different. He had the foresight to see beyond one transaction, one season. He was thinking about routes, networks, leverage. Each deal was a lesson. Each successful delivery built his confidence and his credibility. He learned that the real currency in smuggling wasn't cash, it was trust. In the lawless hills, a man's word was worth more than gold. Once he gave his word, Ayoub would honor it, even at personal loss. This reliability made him valuable to both traders and tribal leaders. He developed relationships that stretched across provinces: Sindh, Baluchistan, even into Iran and Afghanistan. Men twice his age began treating him as an equal. He had something they didn't: a calm intelligence, a sense of strategy. He knew when to push, when to stay still, and when to make himself invisible. The frontier trade had long been dominated by rough men, smugglers with rifles slung across their backs and tempers to match. But Ayoub brought calculation to chaos. He began investing in logistics: trucks, drivers, and safe houses. He studied routes the way a scholar studies scripture, memorizing terrain, timing, and risk. While others focused on the next load, he thought about entire supply chains. His operation started to resemble something far more organized than the average smuggler's venture. And as the 1970s drew near, opportunity, and danger, began to expand. Hashish had always been part of the tribal economy, used for medicine, ritual, and trade. But in the early 1970s, the world beyond the frontier began to change. The hippie movement in the West had turned the Afghan and Pakistani highlands into destinations of desire. Western travelers came seeking spiritual escape and exotic substances. What was once local became global. Suddenly, the dark green resin from Afghan poppy and cannabis fields was worth more than gold in European markets. And the man who could move it safely across borders would become rich beyond imagination. Ayub noticed this shift early. While others dismissed the Western demand as a passing trend, he saw its potential. The mountains had always produced hashish, but now, the world was paying attention. At first, his role was small. He moved shipments for other traders, earning commission. He arranged transport through trusted tribal routes, ensuring security through alliances and payments. His success depended on relationships, with drivers, with border guards, with tribal chiefs whose lands the convoys crossed. He treated each of them with respect and generosity, ensuring loyalty where others relied on fear. Slowly, his reputation grew. Where other smugglers made enemies, Ayub made allies. He understood that in the frontier, every friendship was a form of insurance. But even a careful man must take risks to grow. His first major gamble came when he agreed to transport an unusually large shipment of hashish, hundreds of kilograms hidden in trucks loaded with dried fruit. The route ran through Khyber, across the plains, and toward Karachi, where international ships awaited. The operation required precision. Every checkpoint, every driver, every bribe had to be accounted for. Ayub planned it like a military campaign. When the trucks finally reached their destination unscathed, it wasn't just a financial victory, it was a signal. Word spread through the smuggling networks, Ayub Afridi had pulled off what few dared attempt. After that, his name carried weight. Dealers from Quetta, Peshawar, and even Dubai sought him out. He was no longer just a middleman, he was becoming a brand. His calm demeanor and sharp negotiating skills earned him respect even from rivals. He paid well, delivered on time, and protected his men. In a business where betrayal was routine, Ayub's loyalty was a rare commodity. And loyalty, in time, became his greatest weapon. But success attracted attention. Local authorities, long indifferent to small traders, began to notice the scale of his operations. Customs officials grew suspicious, though many were easily bought. The government occasionally conducted raids, but Ayub was always one step ahead. Informants tipped him off, and shipments vanished into the hills before soldiers arrived. Each time, he emerged unscathed, more myth than man. The legend of his luck spread, though it wasn't luck at all, it was planning, precision, and a deep understanding of human nature. He knew that fear and greed could move men faster than any truck ever could. There were darker lessons too. Smuggling was not a world of friendship alone. Rivals tried to cut into his routes, gangs ambushed convoys, and sometimes even allies turned greedy. In one story whispered among truckers, a rival trader once stole a load meant for Ayub's network. Days later, the man's warehouse burned to the ground. No one was killed, but the message was clear: betrayal carried consequences. Ayub never shouted, never threatened, but those who crossed him seldom repeated their mistake. He understood that reputation was a form of currency, and it had to be defended. As his network expanded, Ayub's life began to shift from local to regional scale. He began visiting Karachi more often, exploring contacts at the port. There, he saw the future, the international dimension of smuggling. Ships could carry what trucks could not. The world beyond the mountains was vast, and so were its markets. Dubai was emerging as a new hub for trade, and Ayub's instincts told him it would play a crucial role in what was coming. But before he could look outward, he had to solidify his control at home. To the people of Landi Kotal, Ayub was no longer just a trader, he was a provider. He funded community events, resolved disputes, and quietly paid debts for struggling families. When drought struck, his trucks brought food and supplies. The line between outlaw and benefactor blurred. In the eyes of many, he was a hero, a man who brought prosperity to a region long forgotten by the government. Even those who disapproved of his business found it hard to deny the stability he brought. Power, once elusive, had now found him naturally. Yet, amid this rising influence, Ayub remained grounded. He still prayed in the same mosque, still drank tea in the same hujra, still moved through the bazaars with minimal guards. His humility was strategic, it disarmed enemies and comforted allies. But deep inside, he knew the path ahead would not stay simple. The trade was changing. Demand was growing. Money was flowing faster than ever. And with it came the attention of forces far greater than any tribal council, the state, foreign intelligence, and the emerging global war on drugs. One evening, as he sat overlooking the border hills, he confided to a close associate that he could feel the winds shifting. "The world is changing," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we must learn to move with it, not against it." It was a statement that would define his philosophy for the rest of his life. To survive, one had to adapt, not resist, not rebel, but flow with the current while quietly steering it. The quiet smuggler from Landi Kotal had taken his first real steps into legend. He had built trust, created structure, and proven that intelligence could conquer even the most lawless terrain. Yet, even as he expanded his reach, a new world was stirring just beyond the horizon, one that would test every ounce of his cunning. Soon, politics, war, and power would converge upon his world. But for now, under the cold stars of the frontier, Ayub Afridi was still just a trader, a man who had learned how to turn dust into gold, and silence into influence. The 1970s marked a turning point not only for Pakistan but for the entire world, a decade of shifting powers, ideological battles, and hidden opportunities. For Haji Ayub Afridi, this was the era that would transform him from a respected smuggler into a transnational figure, a man whose name would travel far beyond the dusty roads of Landi Kotal. The world was changing, and the frontier was becoming the epicenter of something much larger, a silent war of trade, power, and influence. By now, Ayub's network stretched across the borderlands like veins in a living body. The routes he had once used to move dry fruit and textiles were now conduits for something far more valuable: Afghan hashish, Pakistani opium, and later, the refined white powder that would alter global history, heroin. But this transition didn't happen overnight. It began with small adjustments, subtle shifts in demand, and a growing realization that the smuggling world was evolving into something industrial. The West's appetite for narcotics was expanding rapidly, and Afghanistan's fertile poppy fields provided an endless supply. All it needed was organization, and men like Ayub were ready to provide it. In the early 1970s, Afghanistan was still under the rule of King Zahir Shah, a relatively stable period when tribal trade flourished across porous borders. But when the monarchy fell in 1973, followed by years of political instability and coups, the Afghan state weakened. Local warlords, tribal elders, and merchants began to operate with greater independence. For traders like Ayub, instability meant opportunity. The lack of centralized control made cross-border movement easier. Bribes worked better than laws, and alliances mattered more than politics. Ayub used his tribal connections to navigate this shifting landscape. His name became synonymous with reliability, a man who could get things done, no matter the circumstance. It was during this period that he began forging relationships with powerful Afghan figures, many of whom controlled production in the country's eastern provinces. Ayub provided transportation, logistics, and protection, while they ensured supply. His convoys moved by night, guided by drivers who knew every rock and ravine, their headlights off as they crept through the borderlands. The goods were stored in hidden depots on the Pakistani side, often disguised as legitimate trading posts. From there, the shipments moved to Karachi, and eventually to Dubai, a city rapidly becoming the new gateway between East and West. Dubai in the mid-1970s was a different world. Still in its infancy as a global hub, it was open, loosely regulated, and hungry for commerce of any kind. Gold, electronics, and luxury goods passed through its ports, but so too did items never meant for customs declarations. Ayoub quickly recognized Dubai's potential. He began frequenting the city, establishing relationships with merchants, bankers, and expatriates who operated in the gray zones of international trade. His charisma and calm authority earned him access to circles where few Pashtun traders had ever ventured. In the small tea houses of Dera, deals were struck that would shape the future of the narcotics trade across Asia. Back home, Ayoub's influence was deepening. His growing wealth allowed him to expand his network, not just with traders and drivers, but with politicians, police officers, and customs officials. He knew that real power wasn't only about moving goods, it was about controlling who looked away and when. In a time when corruption was rampant and governance uneven, Ayoub understood the game better than anyone. He never flaunted his wealth, never openly defied authority, but he quietly ensured that anyone who mattered benefited from his success. Cash flowed in all directions, to the right people, in the right amounts, at the right time. By the late 1970s, Ayoub's operations had grown so vast that they resembled a private industry. His men were disciplined and well paid. Drivers received bonuses for successful deliveries. Local villagers along the routes were compensated for their silence and cooperation. Even tribal elders, who might otherwise oppose smuggling, were brought into the fold through gifts, loans, and respect. This ecosystem of loyalty became Ayoub's invisible army, an organization built not on violence but on trust and shared profit. It was a system that the state could neither fully control nor entirely destroy. But as his empire expanded, so did the stakes. The United States had begun to take notice of the rising flow of heroin into Western cities. International pressure was building on Pakistan to crack down on narcotics. Yet, ironically, this same era saw Pakistan's intelligence agencies beginning to explore covert relationships with Afghan factions, long before the Soviet invasion. The borderlands were becoming strategic terrain. Smuggling networks like Ayoub's were no longer just criminal enterprises, they were also valuable intelligence assets. The same routes that carried hashish could, under different orders, carry weapons, money, or information. Ayoub's connections with Afghan leaders and his ability to move freely between tribal zones made him useful to many. Rumors spread that he occasionally assisted in discreet operations for certain government elements, providing logistics or intelligence when it suited mutual interests. These whispers only enhanced his myth. He became something of a ghost figure, walking the thin line between outlaw and ally, between commerce and politics. The heroin trade was the next great transformation. By the late 1970s, laboratories began to appear near the border, where raw opium was refined into heroin. These makeshift labs were often hidden in the mountains or disguised as grain storage houses. The product was potent, profitable, and far easier to transport than bulk opium. Ayoub was cautious at first, he preferred the relative simplicity of hashish and opium. But the profits from heroin were irresistible. A single kilogram could earn more than an entire truckload of older goods. Slowly, carefully, he allowed his network to adapt, but always with layers of separation. He dealt only with trusted intermediaries, keeping his own hands clean of direct production. This distance was deliberate, he understood that the more invisible he remained, the longer he could survive. By now, Ayoub's image in the tribal belt had taken on an almost legendary quality. To the poor, he was a benefactor, a man who built schools, repaired mosques, and gave generous donations at weddings and funerals. To his rivals, he was an enigma, always polite, always composed, yet impossible to outmaneuver. And to the government, he was both a problem and a solution, a man they couldn't fully control, but one whose influence they couldn't afford to lose. There were stories told of how Ayoub could sit across a table from both smugglers and ministers, treating them with equal respect. He spoke little, listened carefully, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. Even those who despised his trade admitted his intelligence. His empire, though built on illegality, was run with discipline that many legal institutions lacked. Trucks were registered, accounts were kept, and punishments for disloyalty were swift but measured. Yet, beneath the surface of his calm success, Ayoub knew danger was coming. The winds from Afghanistan were beginning to howl louder. In 1978, the Saur revolution overthrew the Afghan monarchy, bringing a communist government to power. This would soon trigger resistance, rebellion, and foreign intervention. The Soviets were preparing to enter Afghanistan, and with them would come the chaos of war, and with war, new opportunities, but also new risks. As Ayoub looked across the Khyber Pass in those days, he could sense history shifting before his eyes. The trade routes he had spent years perfecting would soon become the arteries of a different kind of movement, not just goods, but guns, fighters, and ideology. The stage was being set for something far greater than smuggling. For Ayoub, it was both a warning and an invitation. He once told a confidant, while sipping tea in a Karachi guest house, "The world doesn't stay still. You either move with it, or it moves over you." He had survived by adapting, and he would do so again. But what he couldn't yet know was that the coming war would elevate him to heights no smuggler had ever reached, and cast him into shadows no man could fully escape. For now, however, the 1970s ended with Ayoub at the peak of his power. His network spanned nations, his name commanded respect from mountain tribes to coastal ports, and his wealth had become generational. But beyond the horizon, the red flag of the Soviet Union was rising over Kabul, and with it, the dawn of a new, dangerous chapter that would intertwine his fate with global history. The winter of 1979 was unlike any other. Snow fell heavy over the mountain passes, muffling the distant echoes of artillery fire that began to roll in from the north. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and with their tanks came a storm that would reshape not only the politics of Central Asia, but the underworld economies that thrived in its shadows. For Haji Ayoub Afridi, this was not merely a geopolitical event, it was the opening of a new frontier. The frontier he had once used to smuggle hashish and opium would soon become the artery through which the world's most secretive war was fought. Ayoub watched as his homeland became a staging ground for something enormous. Refugees flooded across the border, tens of thousands at first, then millions. The mountains of the tribal belt filled with families displaced by war, men carrying rifles, women carrying children, and behind them, the crumbling echo of a nation torn apart. The chaos was staggering, but in chaos, Ayoub saw both danger and possibility. The United States and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, began to form covert alliances to support the Afghan Mujahideen, the resistance fighters who took up arms against the Soviet occupation. Billions of dollars in weapons, supplies, and covert funds began to pour into Pakistan under what would later be known as Operation Cyclone. The CIA supplied resources, the ISI distributed them, and on the ground, men like Ayoub Afridi became the invisible hands ensuring the flow reached its intended, and sometimes unintended, destinations. Ayoub's unique position made him invaluable. He was a tribal elder, a businessman, and a man who understood both sides of the frontier. He had contacts inside Afghanistan and influence within Pakistan. His smuggling routes had become arteries that could now move not just goods, but ammunition and weapons. The same drivers who once carried contraband now carried crates marked in foreign alphabets, rifles, machine guns, even surface-to-air missiles. The lines between trade and war blurred completely. At first, Ayoub kept his operations discreet. Officially, he was a trader and community figure aiding refugees. Unofficially, he became one of the crucial facilitators in the logistical web that sustained the Afghan resistance. His warehouses in the Khyber region served dual purposes: humanitarian storage by day, covert transshipment points by night. The war economy was expanding, and Ayoub's network was perfectly placed to manage it. But it wasn't only weapons that crossed the border. In the shadows of the Mujahideen War, another trade flourished: heroin. With the Soviet invasion disrupting agriculture and local economies, Afghan farmers turned increasingly to opium poppy cultivation as their main source of income. Warlords encouraged it, smugglers moved it, and the profits funded resistance operations. The West, eager to bleed the Soviets dry, turned a blind eye. As one American officer later said, the priority was defeating Moscow, not fighting drugs. For Ayub, this was both an opportunity and a dilemma. The heroin trade was becoming more dangerous, but also more lucrative. Entire villages were now producing opium paste, which was refined into heroin in clandestine labs hidden in mountain valleys. The scale was unprecedented, and the money flowed like a river. Ayub's routes once again became vital channels, and his influence expanded even further. Yet he was careful, maintaining a public image of a nationalist supporter and community benefactor. To the locals, he was the man who distributed food and aid to refugees. To the intelligence networks, he was a cooperative intermediary. To smugglers, he was the undisputed king. Stories began to circulate, stories of CIA officers meeting tribal leaders under the cover of night, of weapons convoys disguised as relief shipments, and of Ayub's men quietly ensuring that no one interfered. In these borderlands, lines of allegiance were fluid. One day, a convoy might carry American rifles bound for the Mujahideen. The next, it might transport heroin bound for Karachi's docks. The same roads, the same men, different cargo, and a world none of the outside powers truly understood. Ayub's role was never publicly acknowledged, but everyone who mattered knew his importance. He became a bridge between competing realities, a smuggler who could talk politics, a tribal leader who could negotiate with generals, a criminal who understood diplomacy. His authority extended beyond money, it came from the respect he commanded. In the tribal code of Pashtunwali, he upheld honor, and badal, reciprocity, principles that kept his men fiercely loyal. Even foreign intelligence agents, used to dealing with bribes and deception, found his directness disarming. Meanwhile, Karachi, once just a coastal city, had become the endpoint of this global underground network. Heroin flowed through its ports, hidden in shipments bound for Europe and America. The city's underworld grew fat on the proceeds, and Pakistan soon gained a new, darker reputation as a narcotics hub. The money that poured and transformed not only criminal empires but also politics. Bribes climbed to new heights, corruption became systemic. Even government officials began to rely on this shadow economy to sustain influence. Ayub, however, maintained a strange balance. Unlike other smugglers, he didn't indulge in excess. His home remained modest by the standards of his wealth. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, and rarely traveled for pleasure. To many, he seemed more like a statesman than a drug lord, calm, strategic, and deeply aware of the fragile ecosystem that kept him alive. But beneath that calm was a constant tension. He was playing both sides, cooperating with state agencies on one hand, and profiting from the illicit economy on the other. One wrong move could bring everything crashing down. By 1983, as the war in Afghanistan intensified, Ayub's name had become almost mythical. Western journalists whispered about a man they called the Hashish King. Intelligence officers referred to him in coded reports. And in the tribal belt, children heard his name spoken with both fear and admiration. But the same fame that elevated him also began to cast shadows. Too many eyes were watching, too many stories were being told. He had become indispensable, and therefore dangerous. One night, sitting in a gathering of elders near Jamrud, Ayub reportedly remarked, "We are all traders here, only our goods have changed." There was laughter, but his words carried a heavy truth. The borderlands had become a market of chaos, and he, knowingly or not, was its chief merchant. As the decade wore on, the flow of heroin reached epidemic levels in the West. Governments that had once turned a blind eye now began to panic. International agencies started tracing supply lines back to Pakistan, and soon, Ayub's name surfaced in confidential reports. Washington began pressuring Islamabad to act. The same man who had quietly supported anti-Soviet operations was now seen as part of a global narcotics crisis. For the first time, Ayub felt the weight of global scrutiny. The Americans wanted the drug trade curbed. The Pakistani government needed to show results. The ISI, caught between its covert alliances and international expectations, began tightening its grip. The net was slowly drawing closer. But Ayub was no ordinary smuggler. He had survived transitions before, from trader to trafficker, from outlaw to power broker. And once again, he would adapt. The Soviet-Afghan War might have created him, but it also planted the seeds of his eventual downfall. Still, for now, in the early 1980s, Haji Ayub Afridi stood at the center of history, a man whose choices influenced wars, economies, and destinies. He was part businessman, part patriot, part outlaw, and as long as the war raged on, the world still needed men like him. But the question lingered in the air, quiet and dangerous: what happens to men like Ayub when the war ends, when the guns fall silent, and the allies who once depended on him turn their gaze elsewhere? The answer would come soon enough, and it would not come kindly. The mid-1980s brought a new rhythm to life along the Khyber Pass. Convoys moved as if in a carefully choreographed dance, each truck a note in a symphony of commerce and clandestine dealings. Haji Ayub Afridi had mastered this rhythm, orchestrating a network that now extended from the remote mountain valleys of Pakistan into the global markets of Europe and the Middle East. Yet, the greater his reach, the more intricate the balancing act became. He was no longer simply a tribal trader or even a regional smuggler. He had become a central figure in a complex web where politics, war, and narcotics intertwined. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was intensifying, and with it came waves of refugees and fighters crossing the border. Each border checkpoint presented potential conflict, each mountainous pass a stage for ambush or betrayal. Ayub's expertise lay in reading the subtle currents of this dangerous environment. He knew which tribal elders could be persuaded, which border officials were corruptible, and which rivals were patient enough to wait for an opening. His strategy was meticulous, every route was mapped, every driver trained, every contingency anticipated. In many ways, his operations resembled those of a military general more than a smuggler. By this point, his network had grown so large that he employed hundreds of men, drivers, loaders, guards, and local intermediaries, each with a specific role and responsibility. Loyalty was non-negotiable, and Ayub maintained it through a combination of respect, fair compensation, and subtle enforcement. Rumors of retribution for betrayal circulated, though Ayub himself rarely had to intervene directly. The mere knowledge that he was watching, calculating, observing, waiting, was often enough to maintain discipline. This quiet authority was his hallmark. The heroin trade had become increasingly central to his empire. The refining labs hidden in remote Afghan valleys produced a product whose quality and consistency allowed him to dominate markets in Europe and the Middle East. Each shipment was carefully labeled, packaged, and routed to minimize risk. Dubai remained the key transshipment point, and Ayub cultivated relationships with influential merchants and port authorities who could facilitate discreet passage. His acumen lay in understanding the global dynamics at play, knowing when to push shipments quickly to exploit market demand, and when to slow operations to avoid attracting attention. Despite the immense profits, Ayub never lost sight of his roots. He remained deeply connected to his tribal lands and people. Schools, mosques, and community projects funded by his earnings not only reinforced his social standing but also created a network of gratitude and loyalty. Families whose lives were touched by his generosity spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a man who could be both fearsome and benevolent. This duality, merciless to rivals but protective of his people, became a defining feature of his legend. The global attention on Afghanistan and Pakistan added layers of complexity. Intelligence agencies, foreign diplomats, and investigative journalists all moved through the region, each pursuing their own interests. Ayub navigated this labyrinth with remarkable skill. He offered cooperation selectively, providing assistance to agencies when it served his strategic goals, yet he remained independent. His ability to operate simultaneously within the legal and illegal, the political and criminal, elevated him above ordinary figures in the underworld. He was both a participant and an observer, a man whose calculations often outpaced those of officials with entire bureaucracies at their disposal. However, the larger the empire, the more precarious its foundation. Rival smugglers began to emerge, ambitious men drawn by the same global demand that fueled Ayoub's rise. Some sought to cut him out of lucrative routes, others aimed to control entire regions of production. These conflicts rarely erupted into open warfare, but they required constant vigilance. Ayoub's response was strategic rather than violent. He negotiated alliances, offered financial incentives, and occasionally absorbed rivals into his network. By turning competition into collaboration, he minimized risk while expanding influence. Meanwhile, the United States and Pakistan's ISI continued to fund and arm the Afghan resistance, creating a volatile backdrop. Convoys that carried arms also carried drugs. Ayoub was keenly aware of this paradox. The very organizations he sometimes aided to defeat the Soviets were also indirectly facilitating the heroin trade that enriched him. Yet he navigated these contradictions with a rare subtlety, understanding that survival in this era required adaptability, discretion, and patience. Ayoub's influence also extended into political circles. He was no longer simply a tribal elder or smuggler. He had become a figure whose support could sway local elections, mediate disputes between rival factions, and influence policy decisions. Politicians recognized his authority, understanding that cooperation with him could ensure stability in the volatile border regions. This blend of criminal entrepreneurship and political leverage made him a singular figure, respected, feared, and indispensable. In addition to strategy and diplomacy, Ayoub understood the importance of optics. He rarely flaunted his wealth. His home remained modest by the standards of his earnings, and he maintained a visible connection with the people who lived in his community. This understated presence reinforced his credibility and allowed him to operate under the radar of both local authorities and international scrutiny. While his empire was vast, his personal footprint remained carefully calibrated. Yet, despite his mastery, Ayoub was not immune to tension and anxiety. The very forces that elevated him, foreign powers, rising markets, and political volatility, also posed existential threats. Every convoy could be intercepted, every alliance could be broken, every mistake could be fatal. He remained vigilant, understanding that even a single miscalculation could unravel decades of carefully built influence. His calm exterior masked a constant mental calculation of risk versus reward. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ayoub's operations was his integration of the local population. Villagers along key routes were not merely bystanders, they were participants, compensated for their cooperation and protected by their loyalty to him. This decentralized network allowed him to scale operations without overextending, and it created a buffer against both state interference and rival incursions. In essence, his empire functioned like a living organism, with each part contributing to the survival and success of the whole. Ayoub also maintained a careful balance between public perception and secrecy. While his humanitarian efforts reinforced his reputation among locals, he ensured that his criminal dealings remained invisible. He cultivated trust selectively, sharing information only with those whose loyalty was beyond question. This selective transparency became a key component of his power, enabling him to manage both fear and admiration in equal measure. As the 1980s progressed, the volume of narcotics flowing through Ayoub's network expanded dramatically. Shipments reached new markets, and the profits funded further expansion, allowing him to invest in vehicles, secure storage, and personnel. Yet with growth came greater scrutiny. International agencies began tracing drug flows back to Pakistan, and internal pressures from rival groups intensified. Ayoub had to navigate an increasingly complex web of interests, balancing profit, loyalty, and survival with an almost preternatural sense of timing. In quiet moments, Ayoub would often reflect on the paradox of his position. He had risen from a small trader in Landi Kotal to a figure whose influence spanned nations. He had navigated wars, political upheavals, and rivalries with a combination of intelligence, strategy, and patience. And yet, every success carried the weight of risk, a reminder that empires built in shadows are always vulnerable to exposure. Despite this tension, his reputation remained untarnished. Drivers and intermediaries spoke of him with reverence, colleagues admired his foresight, and even rivals acknowledged his brilliance. Ayoub had become more than a smuggler, he was a strategist, a negotiator, and a statesman in his own right. His empire was a testament to discipline, intelligence, and the careful orchestration of human relationships across a landscape defined by volatility. By the late 1980s, Haji Ayoub Afridi had become a legend in his lifetime, a man whose life bridged the worlds of crime, politics, and war. He had built an empire that was both admired and feared, one that relied on loyalty, strategy, and meticulous planning. The frontier had given him opportunity, and he had seized it with a rare combination of skill and foresight. Yet, as history would soon show, even the most carefully constructed empires faced the inevitability of change, and Ayoub's story was approaching one of its most critical turning points, where global forces, personal ambition, and historical events would converge with consequences beyond his control. The late 1980s brought both opportunity and peril to the world of Haji Ayoub Afridi. The Soviet Union had withdrawn from Afghanistan, leaving behind a fractured nation teetering on the edge of chaos. Refugees had begun returning to their devastated villages, but many found their homes destroyed, their livelihoods gone, and the poppy fields that had once promised wealth now contested by warlords and militias. For Ayoub, the changing landscape meant that the dynamics of power, trade, and influence were entering a new phase. The war that had elevated him to prominence was ending, but the empire he had built on its back required adaptation, foresight, and strategic cunning more than ever. The heroin trade, which had grown exponentially during the Soviet-Afghan War, now faced a complex challenge. Previously, the conflict had acted as both cover and catalyst. Convoys moved under the guise of supporting the Mujahideen, border chaos concealed the movement of narcotics, and Western powers turned blind eyes to the trade that funded resistance. Now, with the war's end, those protective shadows were fading. International attention began to shift toward eradicating heroin production and tightening enforcement at transit points. This meant that every shipment carried greater risk, and Ayoub had to devise new strategies to maintain his profits while avoiding exposure. Ayoub's network, honed over decades, proved invaluable in this era. He had long emphasized loyalty, discipline, and meticulous planning, traits that now allowed him to navigate a world more dangerous than any battlefield. Drivers were trained not only to transport goods but to anticipate inspection protocols, adapt routes in real time, and respond to emergencies with precision. Intelligence gathering became as important as smuggling itself. Every checkpoint, official, and rival was monitored for potential threats. The mountains and valleys that had once provided concealment now demanded even greater skill to traverse safely. Yet, with growing complexity came internal tension. Rival factions within Pakistan and Afghanistan, eager to capitalize on post-war uncertainty, began to challenge his authority. Some sought to seize key smuggling routes, while others aimed to take control of production hubs. Ayoub's response combined strategy with diplomacy. He negotiated alliances where possible, offering incentives and profit-sharing arrangements, while using subtle intimidation to dissuade direct confrontations. His ability to turn potential rivals into partners was a hallmark of his leadership and contributed to the stability of his empire amid regional upheaval. During this period, Ayoub also strengthened his international connections. Dubai continued to be a critical transshipment hub, and he expanded relationships with merchants, port officials, and shipping intermediaries who facilitated global distribution. European markets, in particular, were experiencing increased demand for heroin, driven by social and cultural trends. Ayoub's network was well positioned to meet this demand, ensuring that shipments arrived on time and in quality condition. Logistics became a science. Timing, concealment, and coordination were managed with military precision, transforming a criminal enterprise into a sophisticated, quasi-industrial operation. The Afghan civil war that erupted after the Soviet withdrawal further complicated the landscape. Warlords fought for control over territories, and entire regions became contested zones. While this instability posed threats to the movement of goods, it also created opportunities. Ayyub leveraged tribal alliances, employing local knowledge to navigate territories and maintain access to production sites. His reputation for fairness and reliability among tribal leaders ensured cooperation, even in volatile circumstances. This network of loyalty was not only a commercial advantage but a survival mechanism in a region where allegiances could shift overnight. Ayyub's influence extended beyond smuggling. He had become a mediator and power broker, capable of resolving disputes among tribes, local leaders, and even minor political figures. His interventions were often quiet and indirect, relying on negotiation and strategic counsel rather than overt force. This ability to operate in a political dimension enhanced his stature, making him an indispensable figure in both local and regional contexts. His empire was thus as much about human networks and social capital as it was about narcotics and commerce. Despite these successes, Ayyub understood that global scrutiny was intensifying. Western governments and law enforcement agencies were increasingly aware of heroin flows from Afghanistan through Pakistan. Reports emerged linking narcotics trade to regional instability, and Pakistan faced international pressure to curb trafficking. Ayyub's operations were therefore under greater threat than ever before. To counter this, he implemented sophisticated measures, compartmentalizing operations, using trusted intermediaries, and maintaining strict secrecy about his personal involvement. He had learned from experience that invisibility was often the greatest protection in the underworld. At home, Ayyub maintained his public persona as a community benefactor and tribal leader. His investments in local infrastructure, educational initiatives, and humanitarian support reinforced loyalty and respect among the people. He was seen as a stabilizing force in an era of chaos, a man who could deliver both security and prosperity. This careful management of perception helped shield him from political scrutiny and kept the support of key local constituencies. The duality of his image, respected leader by day, influential trafficker by night, became central to his enduring power. The interplay between political events and the narcotics trade also demanded strategic foresight. Ayyub recognized that shifting alliances, both within Afghanistan and among Pakistani authorities, could alter the balance of power rapidly. He adapted by cultivating multiple lines of influence, ensuring that he was never overly reliant on a single ally or route. Contingency planning became integral to his operations, a reflection of both his strategic mind and the lessons he had learned navigating decades of volatility along the Khyber frontier. The late 1980s also saw increased technological developments in communication and transportation. Radios, telephones, and early computer systems allowed Ayyub to monitor shipments and maintain coordination over vast distances. He combined modern technology with traditional methods, such as trusted couriers and visual signaling, to ensure operational security. This hybrid approach enhanced efficiency while preserving the discretion necessary in an era before sophisticated international surveillance networks. Even as his network expanded, Ayyub remained vigilant about the human element. Loyalty and trust were paramount, and he understood that a single betrayal could unravel years of careful planning. He selected key personnel with meticulous attention, ensuring that they shared both his vision and his discipline. Mentorship and guidance were central to his leadership style, fostering a cadre of lieutenants capable of managing complex operations independently while maintaining alignment with his strategic objectives. During this period, his interactions with the international community were subtle but significant. He engaged with intermediaries from Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, negotiating terms and ensuring that his shipments met market demands. The sophistication of his operations drew attention from law enforcement and intelligence agencies, though Ayyub's careful compartmentalization and operational security minimized direct exposure. The combination of strategic foresight, disciplined personnel, and networked influence allowed him to remain a step ahead of potential threats. The post-Soviet withdrawal era was thus a paradox: chaos created opportunity, but opportunity carried risk. Ayyub's genius lay in his ability to navigate this paradox with calm precision. He leveraged instability, built alliances, and integrated his operations with both traditional tribal networks and emerging global markets. His empire was a testament to adaptability, foresight, and the subtle art of influence, a model of power that relied not on brute force alone but on intelligence, strategy, and social capital. Yet, amid this calculated expansion, Ayyub remained aware of the fragility of his position. He knew that political shifts, rival ambitions, and international pressure could all converge to threaten his empire. The balance he maintained was delicate, and vigilance was a constant requirement. He understood that the very factors that had enabled his rise, war, political instability, and global demand, could also precipitate his fall. By the end of the decade, Haji Ayyub Afridi had solidified his reputation as a masterful strategist, a shrewd businessman, and a formidable figure in the underworld. His empire spanned borders, connected continents, and influenced both local and global events. He had transformed from a tribal trader into a transnational power broker whose operations blurred the lines between legality and illegality, war and commerce, loyalty and coercion. Yet, even as he reached these heights, the world around him was changing once more, setting the stage for challenges that would test every ounce of his cunning and resilience. The story of this period in Ayyub's life is a story of adaptation, vision, and calculated risk. It is a story of a man who understood that power is not static, that opportunity is inseparable from danger, and that the legacy of a life lived on the frontier depends as much on intelligence and foresight as on courage. And as the 1990s loomed on the horizon, Ayyub's empire, like the mountains themselves, stood as both enduring and impermanent, a testament to a life built on the edge of law, order, and history itself. The dawn of the 1990s brought with it a new era of both uncertainty and immense opportunity for Haji Ayyub Afridi. The mountains and valleys that had once served as corridors of war and smuggling had begun to settle into an uneasy calm after decades of upheaval. Afghanistan was fractured, Pakistan was navigating its own political turbulence, and the global demand for narcotics continued to surge. For Ayyub, this period marked both consolidation and reinvention. The empire he had painstakingly built over decades required not only protection but strategic evolution, as the world outside his tribal belt was changing faster than ever before. By this time, Ayyub's network had matured into a highly disciplined and expansive operation. Convoys moved with precision, warehouses were secured in strategic locations, and communication lines were sophisticated for a region often considered primitive. He had built trust at every level, from tribal elders to foreign intermediaries, creating a system resilient to both betrayal and the increasing scrutiny of international law enforcement. The people who worked for him understood the importance of discretion. The loyalty that had been carefully cultivated over decades remained his most valuable asset. The heroin trade had now solidified as the backbone of his operations. Afghan poppy fields continued to produce massive quantities of opium, and refinements into heroin were increasingly controlled by well-organized labs hidden deep in the mountains. Ayyub's logistical expertise allowed him to move this product from production zones to Karachi and Dubai, and eventually onto European markets, with remarkable efficiency. Each shipment was carefully documented, compartmentalized, and monitored, ensuring minimal risk of interception. He understood the importance of timing. A shipment arriving too early or too late could disrupt markets, damage alliances, or attract unwanted attention from authorities. The post-Soviet era also created new rivalries and political dynamics. Warlords who had once depended on Ayyub for logistical support now sought to assert independence. Some were emboldened by sudden wealth, others were motivated by vengeance or territorial ambition. Ayyub met these challenges with a mixture of negotiation and subtle intimidation. He offered profit-sharing deals, mediated disputes, and, when necessary, deployed strategic pressure to maintain control. By converting potential adversaries into allies, he expanded his influence while minimizing open conflict, a hallmark of his leadership style. Dubai remained a crucial hub in this global operation. The city's ports, still lightly regulated compared to Western standards, allowed Ayyub to continue moving product internationally. He cultivated relationships with merchants, shipping agents, and financial intermediaries who operated in the gray zones between legality and commerce. These partnerships ensured that his shipments remained unobstructed, and that profits could flow efficiently. He maintained a careful balance, visible enough to gain trust, but discreet enough to avoid attracting undue attention. Ayyub's ability to navigate both local and global politics had become a defining feature of his empire. He maintained influence with local politicians, tribal leaders, and even certain elements of the Pakistani intelligence apparatus. His reputation for fairness, loyalty, and reliability allowed him to mediate disputes, negotiate trade agreements, and influence decisions that would have long-reaching consequences for both his network and the wider region. The duality of his role, tribal leader and international operator, provided him with protection, flexibility, and leverage. Yet, the very forces that had enabled his rise also posed new risks. International awareness of Afghanistan's narcotics trade had grown considerably by the early 1990s. Western governments, alarmed by the surge of heroin into Europe, began pressuring Pakistan to take decisive action against traffickers. Investigative journalists, diplomats, and intelligence operatives turned their attention to the Khyber Pass and its legendary networks. Ayyub's careful compartmentalization of operations and emphasis on trusted intermediaries mitigated these risks, but the stakes had never been higher. One misstep could unravel decades of careful planning. The evolving political landscape of Pakistan itself added layers of complexity. Governments changed, policies shifted, and alliances in Islamabad often contradicted promises made months or years prior. Ayyub had learned to adapt quickly, maintaining a degree of separation between his business interests and political entanglements. By staying flexible, he ensured that his operations could continue regardless of which faction held power. His careful cultivation of relationships across tribal, commercial, and governmental spheres became a survival mechanism, allowing him to maneuver with minimal disruption. At the same time, Ayyub continued to invest in his local community. Generosity and strategic philanthropy remained central to his public persona. Schools, mosques, and humanitarian aid projects not only solidified loyalty but also created a buffer against criticism. Families whose lives were touched by his support remained allies, offering both information and protection. This social capital was as essential to his empire as convoys, warehouses, and international connections. The organizational sophistication of his network also extended to human resource management. Key lieutenants were carefully chosen, trained, and mentored to manage operations independently while adhering to Ayyub's strategic vision. This decentralized structure allowed his empire to function efficiently across vast and often dangerous territories. Loyalty and competence were rewarded, while disloyalty was quietly and effectively neutralized. The result was a resilient network capable of surviving political upheaval, rival ambitions, and the constant pressure of international law enforcement. Meanwhile, international markets were becoming more lucrative and more competitive. European demand for heroin continued to rise, and intermediaries increasingly sought reliable suppliers who could deliver quality product on schedule. Ayyub's reputation ensured that he remained a preferred partner, able to negotiate favorable terms while minimizing risk. Shipping routes were constantly reassessed, with contingencies in place for inspections, raids, or rival interference. This operational intelligence, combined with decades of experience, allowed him to dominate markets without drawing excessive attention. Yet, even as he expanded his operations, Ayyub remained acutely aware of the fragility of power built in shadows. The empire he had created relied on secrecy, loyalty, and timing, three elements that could be disrupted in an instant. The post-war environment introduced new players, new ambitions, and new threats, making vigilance an ongoing necessity. He understood that adaptability was the key to survival, and that the strategies that had served him in the past must evolve to meet the challenges of the present. His ability to blend charisma, diplomacy, and tactical intelligence became increasingly important. Ayyub could negotiate with tribal leaders, mediate conflicts between rival factions, and maintain alliances across borders, all while managing the logistical demands of an empire spanning continents. The efficiency and discretion of his operations were remarkable, reflecting a deep understanding of both human nature and the structural dynamics of illicit trade. Throughout this period, Ayyub's public image remained carefully curated. He avoided ostentation, maintained a visible connection to his community, and projected an aura of calm authority. This understated presence served multiple purposes. It reinforced trust, deflected suspicion, and allowed him to operate with discretion even as his influence expanded. While few outsiders fully understood the scope of his empire, those who did recognized his brilliance. As the 1990s progressed, Haji Ayyub Afridi's empire stood as both formidable and precarious. It was a testament to decades of strategic thinking, adaptability, and careful cultivation of human and logistical networks. Yet, the era also marked the beginning of new challenges, greater international scrutiny, emerging rivals, and shifting political landscapes. The very factors that had allowed him to rise to prominence now contained the seeds of potential vulnerability. In essence, this period of Ayyub's life illustrates the delicate balance of power, risk, and opportunity in the underworld. He had transformed from a tribal trader into a transnational figure, managing operations that intertwined with politics, war, and global markets. His empire relied not only on logistics and capital but on human loyalty, strategic foresight, and the ability to navigate contradictions. And as the 1990s advanced, the choices he made during this era would determine not only the continuation of his empire but also the enduring legacy of the man known as the Hashish King, who had played both sides of a complex and ever-shifting world. The early 1990s marked a pivotal turning point for Haji Ayyub Afridi, a period in which the intricate tapestry of his empire began to show both its strength and its vulnerabilities. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan had left behind a fragmented nation, a patchwork of competing warlords and fractured tribal allegiances. In this environment, power was fluid, and the very networks that had once ensured Ayyub's dominance now required constant attention, adaptation, and recalibration. Every decision he made carried weight, for in this post-war landscape, missteps could be catastrophic. The heroin trade remained the cornerstone of his operations, and the demand in European and Middle Eastern markets continued to climb. Ayyub's logistical mastery allowed him to continue moving product with remarkable efficiency. Convoys navigated treacherous mountain passes, employing drivers who were as much scouts and strategists as they were transporters. Every route was carefully mapped, every contingency anticipated. The terrain itself became a silent ally, offering concealment, but also a persistent risk of ambush or natural hazards. Ayyub had long understood that control over the geography of the borderlands was as crucial as control over human resources. Internal pressures, however, were intensifying. The post-Soviet Afghan landscape saw warlords jockeying for supremacy, and many viewed Ayyub's influence as both a threat and an opportunity. Some sought to encroach upon production zones, while others aimed to dominate distribution channels. Ayyub's response was a blend of diplomacy and tactical maneuvering. He negotiated alliances where possible, integrating rivals into his network with incentives and shared profits, and subtly neutralized those unwilling to cooperate. This approach minimized conflict while reinforcing his authority, a hallmark of his strategic brilliance. At the same time, international scrutiny was increasing. Reports linking Pakistan to the global heroin trade had reached Western governments, prompting demands for enforcement and accountability. Law enforcement agencies, intelligence operatives, and investigative journalists turned their attention toward the borderlands. Ayyub's operations were, by necessity, compartmentalized and highly secure, but he understood that the world beyond his mountains now posed a tangible threat. Every shipment carried the weight of risk, and even the most minor oversight could attract attention from agencies capable of disrupting his empire. Dubai and Karachi continued to serve as critical hubs in his network. Merchants, port authorities, and intermediaries who had long facilitated his operations now found themselves navigating an increasingly complex international landscape. Ayyub's ability to maintain these relationships, ensuring the smooth flow of product while avoiding excessive exposure, was crucial. He operated with a blend of diplomacy, subtle negotiation, and quiet authority, ensuring that each shipment reached its destination without incident. The precision and discretion required at this stage surpassed anything in his early years of smuggling. Simultaneously, Ayoub's influence within local and tribal politics remained significant. He had evolved beyond the role of a trader or smuggler into a mediator, strategist, and power broker. Tribal leaders, local politicians, and community elders recognized the value of his counsel, relying on him to resolve disputes, coordinate agreements, and stabilize regions where chaos threatened to reign. His authority was rooted in both respect and fear, and his ability to manage multiple stakeholders with competing interests solidified his unique position. Yet, the empire was not without its cracks. New rivals were emerging, driven by ambition, greed, and the shifting post-war landscape. Some sought to control key smuggling routes, while others aimed to dominate production hubs. These challenges required constant vigilance and strategic foresight. Ayoub's experience, discipline, and understanding of human nature allowed him to navigate these threats, but the environment had become increasingly complex, demanding more nuanced decision-making than ever before. The 1990s also saw technological and logistical changes that affected his operations. Communication systems, including radios and telephones, allowed for faster coordination, while transportation advancements facilitated swifter movement of product. Ayoub integrated these innovations into his existing framework, combining modern technology with the traditional, trusted methods that had long defined his operations. Couriers, drivers, and local allies remained central to his network, ensuring resilience even in the face of evolving challenges. Despite the high stakes, Ayoub remained deeply connected to his community. His philanthropic efforts, funding schools, mosques, and local infrastructure projects, reinforced loyalty and secured social capital essential for operational stability. Villagers who had benefited from his generosity became participants in his network, offering both intelligence and protection. This blending of economic influence, social support, and strategic oversight allowed him to maintain control in an environment increasingly characterized by volatility. The human element of his empire became even more critical during this period. Ayoub carefully selected lieutenants and key personnel, ensuring that they not only understood operational protocols but also shared his vision and discretion. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal quietly but decisively punished. His leadership emphasized foresight, patience, and a calm decisiveness that inspired confidence and mitigated potential fractures within the network. The decentralized yet disciplined nature of his operations allowed his empire to function effectively across vast, contested territories. Global markets for heroin continued to grow, increasing both profits and risks. Ayoub's reputation as a reliable supplier made him a preferred partner for international intermediaries, but it also attracted attention from rival factions and law enforcement. Strategic planning, operational compartmentalization, and the cultivation of trust became paramount. Every transaction required careful calculation, balancing risk, profit, and long-term sustainability. Ayoub's ability to manage these complexities underscored his position as a master strategist in both local and international arenas. Political dynamics in Pakistan and Afghanistan added further layers of complexity. Changing governments, shifting policies, and fluctuating alliances required constant adaptability. Ayoub's success lay in his ability to navigate these shifts without overcommitting to any single faction. By maintaining multiple avenues of influence, he ensured that his empire could endure political volatility while remaining profitable and secure. This strategic flexibility was a defining feature of his leadership. Even as he solidified his empire, Ayoub remained acutely aware of its fragility. Years of careful planning and loyalty networks had protected him thus far, but emerging rivals, international scrutiny, and political changes presented ever-present threats. The awareness of vulnerability informed every decision he made, from the routing of shipments to the selection of personnel and alliances. Vigilance and adaptability were not merely virtues, they were survival mechanisms. Through the early 1990s, Haji Ayoub Afridi's operations exemplified the delicate balance of power, risk, and opportunity. His empire, built on decades of strategy, discipline, and foresight, had evolved from a local smuggling network into a transnational operation influencing politics, commerce, and global narcotics markets. Yet, the very factors that had enabled his ascent, instability, demand, and complex alliances, now carried the seeds of potential vulnerability. This period of his life demonstrates the intricacies of power in a shadow world where loyalty, discretion, and strategy were paramount. Ayyub's brilliance lay in his ability to navigate contradictions, between legality and illegality, loyalty and ambition, local influence and international markets. As the 1990s progressed, the decisions made during this era would define not only the sustainability of his empire but also the legacy of the man whose life straddled the volatile borders of law, war, and commerce. In the quiet moments, away from convoys, shipments, and meetings with tribal leaders, Ayyub must have understood that the world he had mastered for decades was evolving. The very environment that had nurtured his rise was now transforming into a landscape of new threats, rivalries, and scrutiny. And yet, for a man who had navigated wars, revolutions, and shifting alliances, the challenge was familiar: adapt, survive, and continue to wield influence in a world where every move carried weight, consequence, and opportunity. The mid-1990s heralded a new phase in Haji Ayyub Afridi's life, one where the quiet power he had meticulously cultivated over decades began to face both internal and external pressures that tested the limits of his influence. Afghanistan, long a land of conflict and opportunity, had become a fragmented mosaic of warlords and tribal militias vying for dominance. The poppy fields that had once yielded steady profits were now contested territories, controlled by ambitious local leaders whose loyalties shifted with every rising or falling alliance. For Ayyub, the challenge was clear: maintain control of his empire, secure his supply lines, and navigate a landscape where the margins for error had grown dangerously narrow. Ayyub's operations had evolved into a highly disciplined, almost industrial-scale network. He had hundreds of trusted lieutenants, each overseeing critical segments of transportation, warehousing, and international distribution. Convoys moved with military precision, often disguised as humanitarian or commercial shipments to avoid detection by authorities or rival factions. Drivers were carefully trained in navigation, observation, and emergency response, ensuring that shipments could be rerouted or protected in the face of potential threats. Every logistical decision, every movement across treacherous mountain passes, was calculated with painstaking attention to detail. The heroin trade continued to underpin Ayyub's empire, but the markets had changed. Demand in Europe was at an all-time high, yet international law enforcement had intensified monitoring and interdiction efforts. Airports, ports, and border crossings were scrutinized more rigorously than ever before. Ayyub's solution was to diversify routes, employ intermediaries, and create redundancy in his supply chains. He compartmentalized operations so that no single person or location could compromise the entire network. This intricate web of logistics, loyalty, and intelligence allowed him to continue moving vast quantities of narcotics while minimizing exposure. Meanwhile, the political and social dynamics in Pakistan were shifting. The government faced mounting pressure from Western powers to curb the flow of heroin, and internal factions jostled for control of key provinces and economic sectors. Ayyub's connections with local officials, tribal leaders, and influential figures became invaluable. He maintained these relationships through careful negotiation, strategic generosity, and subtle influence. By fostering mutual dependency, he ensured that his operations could continue even under scrutiny, balancing the needs of the state, the community, and his empire. Internally, Ayyub's network faced emerging tensions. Ambitious subordinates and rival traffickers sought to expand their influence, sometimes at the expense of the empire he had built. Ayyub responded not with overt violence but with a combination of diplomacy, incentive, and strategic intimidation. Alliances were reinforced through profit-sharing arrangements and careful integration of potential rivals into his broader network. The message was clear: cooperation was more profitable than conflict, yet loyalty was non-negotiable. This delicate balance of reward and deterrence reinforced discipline and maintained the cohesion of a complex and expansive operation. The cities of Karachi and Dubai remained crucial hubs for international distribution. Shipments from the tribal belt flowed through these ports, where Ayyub's carefully cultivated intermediaries ensured smooth transit. In Dubai, connections with local merchants, financiers, and port officials allowed for discreet forwarding of product to Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. These relationships were nurtured through trust, repeated reliability, and subtle influence, creating an operational advantage that few rivals could match. Despite the scope and sophistication of his empire, Ayyub remained deeply connected to his tribal roots. Philanthropy, social projects, and investments in local infrastructure were not mere displays of generosity, they were strategic tools to maintain loyalty and support. Villagers who had benefited from his contributions often became participants in his network, providing intelligence, protection, and assistance when needed. This combination of social capital and operational mastery reinforced his influence and allowed him to navigate the complexities of the region with unparalleled skill. Technology also began to play a more significant role in Ayyub's operations. Radios, telephones, and early computer systems allowed for improved coordination and monitoring of shipments. This integration of modern tools with traditional networks of couriers, drivers, and tribal allies enhanced operational efficiency while maintaining discretion. Ayyub's ability to blend innovation with tried-and-true methods underscored his adaptability, a quality that had allowed him to survive decades of volatility. Yet, with growth and complexity came heightened risk. International intelligence agencies and law enforcement had become more sophisticated in tracking narcotics flows. Investigations and interdictions increased in frequency and precision, forcing Ayyub to constantly refine his strategies. He emphasized strict compartmentalization, operational secrecy, and careful vetting of personnel to ensure that the empire could withstand scrutiny. Every shipment, every route, and every ally was evaluated for risk, with contingency plans prepared for every conceivable scenario. As his influence expanded, Ayyub also became a de facto mediator in regional disputes. Tribal leaders, minor political figures, and rival factions often turned to him for guidance and arbitration. His authority was derived not only from fear or profit but from a reputation for fairness and strategic acumen. This dual role as both trafficker and peacemaker reinforced his indispensability and extended his reach beyond the purely criminal realm. Despite his enormous power, Ayyub remained vigilant and humble in his personal life. He avoided ostentatious displays of wealth, maintained close ties with his family and community, and projected an aura of calm authority. This understated presence not only reinforced trust among allies but also minimized attention from authorities and rivals. The quiet confidence he exuded became a defining feature of his persona, allowing him to operate effectively in a world defined by volatility and shifting allegiances. The mid-1990s were also marked by the emergence of a new global awareness regarding the heroin trade. Western governments, increasingly alarmed by the impact of Afghan heroin on domestic markets, pressured Pakistan to act. Investigative journalists, diplomats, and law enforcement began to turn their focus toward the Khyber Pass and its legendary traffickers. Ayyub's strategic compartmentalization and trusted network insulated him from direct exposure, but the awareness of heightened scrutiny informed every decision, reinforcing the need for discretion, foresight, and careful planning. During this period, Ayyub's strategic vision extended beyond immediate profits. He understood that maintaining a sustainable empire required careful management of relationships, logistics, and reputation. Human loyalty, tribal alliances, and operational security were as crucial as the heroin trade itself. By balancing these elements, Ayyub ensured that his empire could endure both local instability and international pressure. Moreover, Ayyub remained acutely aware of the paradox that defined his life. The very chaos and conflict that had enabled his rise now contained the seeds of potential vulnerability. Rival factions, international scrutiny, and shifting political landscapes created a dynamic in which success and survival were inseparable. Adaptation, foresight, and strategic intelligence were no longer optional but essential for continued dominance. Through the mid-1990s, Haji Ayoub Afridi demonstrated a remarkable ability to blend operational brilliance with social and political savvy. His empire was an intricate balance of power, logistics, loyalty, and discretion, capable of surviving in an environment where the margin for error had grown dangerously small. Yet even at this stage, the forces that had propelled him to prominence, war, demand, and volatility, hinted at challenges ahead that would test the very foundations of his influence. In quiet moments, away from convoys, negotiations, and border crossings, Ayoub would have reflected on the precariousness of power in a world that had elevated him yet could just as easily dismantle him. The mid-1990s were a testament to his adaptability, strategic foresight, and resilience, a period that both solidified his empire and foreshadowed the coming trials that would define the next chapter of his life as the hashish king who had mastered both sides of a complex and ever-shifting world. The latter half of the 1990s brought with it both consolidation and heightened tension for Haji Ayoub Afridi. By now, he was not merely a regional power broker, he had become a figure whose influence extended across borders, connecting tribal networks in Pakistan and Afghanistan to international markets in Europe and the Middle East. Yet, as his empire grew, so too did the forces that threatened it. Rival warlords, ambitious subordinates, and international law enforcement agencies all began to turn their attention toward him. The mountains and valleys that had long concealed his operations were no longer entirely safe, every shipment carried risk, every alliance demanded careful maintenance, and every decision could trigger unforeseen consequences. The heroin trade, now fully established as the backbone of his operations, had reached unprecedented levels of scale and sophistication. Convoys moved with military precision, employing drivers and couriers who were trained to anticipate inspections, navigate treacherous terrain, and respond to threats. Warehouses were strategically located and guarded, each functioning as a node in an expansive and decentralized network. Ayoub understood that success in this business depended as much on operational discipline as it did on timing, coordination, and secrecy. Even a single lapse could imperil months of work and enormous profits. Rival factions were increasingly bold. Some sought to control key production zones in Afghanistan, while others attempted to dominate transportation routes through Pakistan. Ayoub's response was not rooted in brute force alone, he relied on a combination of diplomacy, negotiation, and selective intimidation. Alliances were reinforced with incentives, potential rivals were integrated into his network, and disputes were mediated quietly to avoid public attention. His ability to convert competition into cooperation allowed him to expand his influence while minimizing the risk of violent confrontation, a strategy that had served him well throughout his career. International scrutiny intensified during this period. Western governments, alarmed by the influx of Afghan heroin, pressed Pakistan to take action. Intelligence agencies, law enforcement officers, and investigative journalists increased their focus on the Khyber Pass and its legendary traffickers. Ayoub's network was highly compartmentalized, designed to withstand scrutiny, but the growing attention meant that the stakes were higher than ever. The margin for error had narrowed, and the need for careful planning, discretion, and loyalty management became paramount. Dubai and Karachi remained central to his operations, functioning as critical nodes in the flow of narcotics to international markets. In Dubai, relationships with merchants, port authorities, and financial intermediaries ensured that shipments moved efficiently and discreetly. Ayoub's network in Karachi facilitated onward transport, bridging the gap between the tribal belt and global distribution points. His ability to maintain these connections, often through a combination of trust, subtle influence, and strategic foresight, was a key factor in sustaining the flow of product and profit. Ayoub's influence was not confined to commerce alone. Over decades, he had become a mediator and advisor in both local and regional disputes. Tribal leaders, local politicians, and even minor government figures relied on his counsel to resolve conflicts, negotiate agreements, and stabilize contested territories. His authority was rooted in both respect and fear, he could command loyalty without overt displays of power, a quality that enhanced his stature and allowed him to operate with remarkable freedom. However, the expanding empire also brought internal challenges. Key lieutenants and subordinates, while loyal, sometimes chafed under Ayyub's strict control or sought greater independence. Ambitious rivals saw opportunities to challenge his dominance, and even minor fractures within the network could have significant consequences. Ayyub's response was a combination of mentorship, incentive, and subtle discipline. He cultivated loyalty through careful attention, rewards for competence, and quiet enforcement against disloyalty. This management of human capital was as crucial to his success as his logistical and strategic expertise. The late 1990s also witnessed technological advances that Ayyub integrated into his operations. Radios, telephones, and early computer systems improved communication across vast and challenging terrains, allowing for quicker coordination of shipments, personnel, and contingencies. He blended these innovations with traditional methods, trusted couriers, local intelligence, and tribal networks, to maintain operational security while enhancing efficiency. This hybrid approach reflected his adaptability and understanding of both modern and traditional forms of power. At the same time, Ayyub maintained a careful public persona. Despite his enormous wealth and influence, he avoided ostentation, remained connected to his community, and projected an aura of calm authority. This understated presence reinforced trust among allies, minimized scrutiny from authorities, and allowed him to operate effectively in a volatile environment. Generosity and strategic philanthropy, funding schools, mosques, and infrastructure, further cemented his reputation and ensured loyalty from those whose lives depended on him. Global markets continued to drive demand for heroin, and Ayyub's reputation as a reliable supplier ensured he remained a central figure in international trade networks. Shipments were meticulously planned, with contingency measures for inspections, rival interference, and other risks. His attention to detail, combined with decades of experience navigating both local and international politics, allowed him to maintain dominance while minimizing exposure. Each successful shipment reinforced his authority, reputation, and financial strength. Yet, the very factors that enabled his success also presented ongoing threats. International intelligence agencies, rival traffickers, and shifting political landscapes introduced constant uncertainty. Ayyub understood that power was fragile, and survival required continuous vigilance, adaptation, and strategic foresight. Every decision, from logistics to alliances, was made with an acute awareness of risk, reward, and long-term sustainability. The human element remained central to his operations. Key lieutenants were carefully chosen for loyalty, competence, and discretion. They were mentored to manage independent operations while remaining aligned with Ayyub's broader strategic vision. This decentralization, combined with strict discipline and loyalty reinforcement, allowed his network to function effectively across vast, contested territories, making it resilient to both internal and external pressures. Ayyub also maintained subtle control over the political dimensions of his empire. His influence with local officials, tribal leaders, and regional figures allowed him to mediate conflicts, broker agreements, and maintain stability. This soft power complemented his operational and logistical control, creating an ecosystem in which his authority was recognized, respected, and rarely challenged openly. Throughout this period, Ayyub demonstrated a remarkable balance of foresight, discipline, and adaptability. His empire, now spanning local tribal networks and international markets, exemplified the intricate interplay between commerce, politics, and human relationships. Loyalty, secrecy, operational intelligence, and strategic negotiation were all integral to maintaining the delicate equilibrium of his empire. The late 1990s were, therefore, a period of consolidation, refinement, and cautious expansion for Haji Ayyub Afridi. While his influence had never been greater, the pressures of a changing world, growing international scrutiny, and emerging rivals meant that he had to navigate his empire with exceptional skill. This era underscored both the resilience and fragility of power built on shadow networks, illustrating how strategy, intelligence, and human loyalty are as critical as force in sustaining influence. In reflection, this chapter of Ayyub's life highlights the combination of operational brilliance, strategic foresight, and social acumen that defined his empire. It was a period in which he balanced opportunity and risk, loyalty and ambition, tradition and innovation. The decisions he made during this time would not only ensure the continuation of his empire but also shape the enduring legacy of a man who had become both a legend and a master of navigating the perilous world between legality, politics, and illicit enterprise. The turn of the millennium marked a complex and transformative period for Haji Ayyub Afridi. By the early 2000s, his empire had matured into a sprawling, highly sophisticated network that spanned the rugged borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan while connecting to markets in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. Afghanistan was entering a new era of uncertainty with the rise of the Taliban and continued regional instability, while Pakistan faced internal political turmoil and increasing international scrutiny. For Ayyub, these changes were both a challenge and an opportunity. His ability to adapt, strategize, and navigate uncertainty would determine the continued survival and influence of his empire. The heroin trade, which had been the cornerstone of his operations for decades, continued to flourish. Afghan poppy fields, cultivated under both traditional tribal management and covert oversight by warlords, remained highly productive. Ayyub's network had perfected the logistics of production, refinement, and distribution, ensuring that quality and supply met growing international demand. Convoys and shipments were coordinated with military-like precision, employing drivers, couriers, and intermediaries trained to handle both environmental hazards and the threat of law enforcement. Every movement was monitored, contingencies planned, and alternate routes maintained to avoid disruption. The political volatility of the region required Ayyub to constantly reassess alliances and power dynamics. Warlords, tribal leaders, and emerging factions posed both opportunities and threats. Some sought to capitalize on his empire by encroaching on key territories, while others viewed cooperation with him as mutually beneficial. Ayyub's approach was subtle yet effective. He negotiated, incentivized loyalty, and maintained a careful balance between authority and diplomacy. Strategic alliances were as essential as operational efficiency, allowing him to maintain dominance while avoiding unnecessary conflicts that could jeopardize profits or safety. The international dimension of his operations had grown more complex. Dubai, Karachi, and other hubs were vital nodes in a network that connected the tribal borderlands to global markets. Merchants, financiers, and port officials played crucial roles in facilitating shipments, while intermediaries ensured smooth transfers and minimized risk of interception. Ayyub's reputation as a reliable and discreet operator made him a preferred partner, yet it also meant that any misstep could attract scrutiny from intelligence agencies and law enforcement. To mitigate this, he compartmentalized his operations, maintained trusted intermediaries, and limited exposure to high-risk contacts. Technological advancement further shaped the operational landscape. Communication systems, including radios, telephones, and early internet connections, allowed for faster coordination, real-time monitoring of shipments, and better management of personnel across vast and often dangerous terrain. Ayyub combined these modern tools with traditional methods, trusted couriers, local informants, and visual signaling, to maintain operational security while enhancing efficiency. This ability to integrate innovation with proven strategies exemplified his adaptability and strategic foresight. At the same time, the human element of Ayyub's empire remained critical. Loyalty and trust were paramount, and he carefully selected lieutenants and key personnel who shared his vision and discipline. Mentorship and oversight ensured that operations could function independently while remaining aligned with his broader strategic objectives. Disloyalty or incompetence was quietly and decisively addressed, reinforcing a culture of discipline and reliability that became the backbone of his enduring success. Community engagement remained a cornerstone of Ayyub's approach. Philanthropy, social projects, and investments in local infrastructure created goodwill and reinforced loyalty among tribal populations. Villagers whose lives were touched by his generosity often became informants, supporters, and facilitators of his operations. This integration of social influence and economic power allowed him to operate with a degree of security and legitimacy unusual for a figure of his notoriety. By blending respect, fear, and strategic generosity, Ayyub ensured the cohesion and resilience of his network. The rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan introduced both challenges and opportunities. The movement's consolidation of power in certain regions threatened traditional trafficking routes, yet also created new avenues for negotiation and alliance building. Ayyub's understanding of tribal dynamics and political landscapes allowed him to navigate this evolving terrain, leveraging relationships and intelligence to maintain access to production areas while minimizing exposure to conflict or enforcement actions. His ability to adapt to these changing dynamics underscored his strategic agility. Global law enforcement and intelligence scrutiny intensified during this period. Western governments, concerned about the flow of heroin into Europe and beyond, pressured Pakistan and Afghanistan to clamp down on trafficking networks. Investigations, surveillance, and interdictions increased in frequency and sophistication. Ayyub's compartmentalized operations, coupled with strict operational security, allowed him to continue functioning effectively despite mounting pressure. His awareness of risk informed every decision, from routing shipments to managing personnel, ensuring the survival of his empire in a highly precarious environment. The early 2000s also witnessed the growing importance of financial strategy. Moving profits internationally without detection required careful planning and trusted networks. Ayyub cultivated financial intermediaries and utilized multiple channels to secure his earnings while avoiding legal exposure. This aspect of his empire, less visible but equally critical, reflected the evolution of his operations from local trafficking to a transnational enterprise with both logistical and financial sophistication. Despite the operational complexity, Ayyub maintained a carefully managed public persona. He avoided overt displays of wealth, maintained ties to his family and tribal community, and projected calm authority. This measured presence reinforced loyalty, minimized attention from authorities, and allowed him to operate discreetly while commanding respect across multiple spheres of influence. His reputation for fairness and reliability became a strategic asset, reinforcing both operational and political leverage. The combination of operational discipline, strategic foresight, and social intelligence allowed Ayyub to sustain and even expand his empire during a time of unprecedented global scrutiny and regional instability. Every decision was calculated, every alliance carefully nurtured, and every shipment meticulously managed. The network he had built was resilient, capable of withstanding internal challenges, rival ambitions, and international pressure alike. Yet, even as he maintained control, the fragility of his position remained apparent. Emerging rivals, shifting political landscapes, and the intensifying focus of law enforcement agencies created an environment in which one misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Ayyub's continued success relied on vigilance, adaptability, and an intimate understanding of both human nature and geopolitical dynamics. This period illustrates the full scope of Ayyub's evolution, from a tribal trader to a transnational power broker whose empire encompassed logistics, finance, and influence across multiple continents. His mastery of operational networks, human loyalty, political negotiation, and strategic foresight solidified his place as one of the most formidable figures in the narcotics trade. Yet, the very forces that had enabled his rise also hinted at potential vulnerabilities that would challenge his empire in the years to come. In essence, the early 2000s represented a stage of both consolidation and precarious balance for Haji Ayyub Afridi. The systems, alliances, and strategies he had refined over decades allowed him to continue thriving, but the ever-shifting political, social, and international landscapes demanded constant attention and adaptation. This era reinforced the enduring truth of his life: power, influence, and survival in the shadow world required a delicate equilibrium of strategy, foresight, and human understanding, qualities that Ayyub had mastered in ways few could match. The mid-2000s represented a critical juncture in the life of Haji Ayyub Afridi, a time when decades of careful empire building were both tested and reinforced. By now, his operations were no longer confined to the rugged mountains and tribal territories of Pakistan and Afghanistan. they had evolved into a transnational network connecting local tribal logistics with international markets, financial systems, and political players. The global context had shifted significantly. Western governments were more vigilant, border enforcement had increased, and media coverage of the Afghan narcotics trade brought additional scrutiny. Within this landscape, Ayoub's ability to balance opportunity, risk, and human loyalty was being tested in ways previously unseen. Ayoub's logistical mastery remained the backbone of his operations. He oversaw a highly compartmentalized network that spanned the Khyber Pass, Karachi, Dubai, and European markets. Every shipment of heroin, opium, or hashish was meticulously planned, with alternative routes mapped in advance to mitigate the risk of interception. Drivers and couriers were highly trained in navigation, observation, and crisis management, often capable of making split-second decisions to ensure the safety of cargo. This operational discipline, honed over decades, allowed Ayoub to maintain the flow of product despite growing international scrutiny and regional instability. The political environment had become more complex. Pakistan was navigating a fragile balance between internal political factions, military oversight, and pressure from international allies to curb narcotics trafficking. Afghanistan, meanwhile, remained fragmented, with Taliban influence expanding in certain regions, warlords vying for control, and the central government struggling to assert authority. Ayoub's influence extended into both countries, giving him a unique position as a mediator, negotiator, and power broker. Tribal leaders, political figures, and regional intermediaries relied on his judgment to resolve disputes, maintain stability, and secure economic interests. His reputation for fairness, discretion, and strategic thinking allowed him to operate effectively across these overlapping spheres of power. Internal dynamics within Ayoub's empire were equally delicate. While loyalty among his lieutenants and key personnel remained high, the scale of his operations introduced new challenges. Ambitious subordinates, eager for greater influence or profit, occasionally tested boundaries, while rival networks sought to exploit perceived weaknesses. Ayoub managed these internal tensions through a combination of mentorship, incentive structures, and subtle deterrence. Competent and loyal subordinates were rewarded with expanded responsibilities and greater profit shares, while threats to the network were quietly neutralized through strategic pressure or reassignment. This careful management of human capital ensured operational continuity and minimized the risk of internal fracturing. The international dimension of Ayoub's enterprise continued to expand. Dubai and Karachi remained critical hubs, linking local production with overseas markets. Merchants, port authorities, and financial intermediaries were carefully cultivated to ensure smooth transactions. Ayoub's personal reputation for reliability, discretion, and strategic foresight made him a trusted partner for international intermediaries, even as the scale of global enforcement efforts increased. Shipments were timed precisely, documentation minimized, and communication between nodes of the network strictly compartmentalized. Each successful transaction reinforced his credibility, authority, and influence. Technological advancement played an increasingly important role in operational security. Radios, telephones, and secure communication channels allowed for real-time coordination and rapid response to threats. Ayoub integrated these tools into a traditional framework of trusted couriers, informants, and tribal intelligence networks. This blend of innovation and tradition enhanced efficiency while maintaining operational discretion. His ability to adapt to technological shifts without compromising the security of his network demonstrated a keen understanding of the evolving dynamics of global narcotics trade and organized crime. Community engagement remained central to his strategy. Ayoub's investments in education, religious institutions, and infrastructure were not simply acts of philanthropy, they were strategic tools to secure loyalty, trust, and influence. Villagers who benefited from his projects often became informants, allies, and operational partners. By intertwining his economic power with social responsibility, Ayoub created a protective network that extended beyond his immediate operational interests. The combination of respect, fear, and mutual benefit reinforced cohesion across his territories. The mid-2000s also saw a shift in the global perception of Afghan narcotics. Western governments increased pressure on Pakistan to enforce stricter controls, and media attention on the heroin trade brought heightened visibility to the region. Investigations and intelligence operations became more sophisticated, with international agencies employing advanced tracking, surveillance, and interdiction methods. Ayoub's compartmentalization of operations, emphasis on trusted intermediaries, and layered security protocols allowed him to continue functioning effectively despite these pressures. Risk management had become as critical as production or distribution. Financial operations were a crucial aspect of sustaining his empire. Moving large volumes of profit internationally without detection required careful planning and trusted networks. Ayoub utilized intermediaries, shell entities, and financial instruments to secure his earnings while minimizing exposure to legal enforcement. This financial sophistication reflected the evolution of his operations from local trafficking to a globally integrated enterprise. Money flow, like logistics, was managed with precision, foresight, and discretion. Despite immense operational complexity, Ayoub maintained an understated personal presence. He avoided flamboyant displays of wealth, nurtured close family and tribal ties, and projected calm authority in public and private spheres. This carefully curated persona reinforced trust, minimized scrutiny, and allowed him to operate effectively across multiple domains of influence. Even rivals recognized his strategic intelligence and the disciplined structure of his operations, lending an aura of invincibility tempered by prudence. The mid-2000s were also a period of subtle adaptation in response to emerging threats. The Taliban's consolidation in parts of Afghanistan altered traditional smuggling routes, requiring logistical adjustments and strategic negotiations. New criminal networks emerged, testing Ayoub's influence in regions where he had previously been unchallenged. Each challenge required careful assessment, alliance building, and strategic maneuvering to maintain the integrity of the empire. His ability to anticipate and respond to these dynamics underscored a level of strategic agility that few rivals could match. Human management remained a cornerstone of operational resilience. Lieutenants were trained to make autonomous decisions aligned with Ayoub's strategic objectives. Disloyalty, incompetence, or recklessness was swiftly and quietly addressed, ensuring operational stability. Loyalty and competence were consistently rewarded, reinforcing a culture of trust, discipline, and shared purpose. This careful cultivation of human capital allowed the empire to function efficiently even under high-pressure conditions and external scrutiny. The combination of operational expertise, political acumen, and social intelligence ensured that Ayoub's network remained resilient. Shipments reached international markets reliably, relationships with allies were maintained, and internal cohesion persisted despite growing pressures. His empire demonstrated the intricate interplay of logistics, human loyalty, strategic foresight, and adaptability that defined enduring power in the shadow world. Yet, the very factors that enabled his success, volatility, high demand, and strategic opportunity, also contained seeds of vulnerability. Shifting political landscapes, emerging rivals, and increasing international scrutiny created an environment where the margin for error was minimal. Ayoub's continued dominance depended on vigilance, foresight, and the ability to navigate ever-changing circumstances with precision. In sum, the mid-2000s exemplified the culmination of Haji Ayoub Afridi's life as a master strategist, logistical genius, and influential mediator. His empire had evolved into a transnational network capable of withstanding internal and external pressures alike, reflecting decades of careful planning, disciplined execution, and human insight. It was a period of consolidation, adaptation, and quiet dominance, a chapter that demonstrated both the heights of his influence and the precarious balance of power in the world he had mastered. The late 2000s brought a period of both consolidation and subtle turbulence for Haji Ayoub Afridi. By this stage, his empire had reached an unprecedented level of complexity, stretching across the tribal belts of Pakistan, the volatile terrains of Afghanistan, and into the global markets of Europe and the Middle East. Yet with expansion came an ever-present undercurrent of vulnerability. The geopolitical landscape had become increasingly unstable, and the balance of power that had allowed Ayyub to operate with relative impunity was shifting in subtle but meaningful ways. Taliban influence in Afghanistan had strengthened in key regions, while rival traffickers and ambitious lieutenants began to test the limits of his authority. The quiet stability he had enjoyed for decades was now tinged with uncertainty, requiring careful observation, strategic foresight, and impeccable timing. Ayyub's operational networks were meticulously maintained. Convoys transporting heroin, opium, and hashish continued to traverse treacherous mountain passes, moving under the cover of night with precision honed over decades. Drivers and couriers were trained to handle both environmental hazards and potential confrontations, making split-second decisions when threats arose. Warehouses in key locations like Karachi and Dubai served as critical nodes for international distribution, and each facility operated with compartmentalized security to minimize exposure. The intricate choreography of these movements demonstrated Ayyub's mastery over both terrain and logistics, ensuring that his empire could function seamlessly across vast and dangerous territories. The political and social landscapes required constant navigation. Pakistan, under international scrutiny, faced mounting pressure to enforce anti-narcotics measures, while Afghanistan remained fragmented and unpredictable. Ayyub's ability to cultivate relationships with tribal elders, warlords, and local officials remained one of his greatest strategic advantages. By positioning himself as both a mediator and a power broker, he secured loyalty and access to territories critical for production and transit. His reputation for fairness and discretion enhanced his influence, allowing him to resolve conflicts quietly while reinforcing the stability of his operations. Internal management became increasingly complex. Lieutenants and subordinates, while largely loyal, began to display ambition fueled by the expanding scope and profitability of the empire. Some sought greater autonomy, while others tested the boundaries of Ayyub's authority. He responded with a combination of mentorship, strategic incentives, and quiet enforcement. Those who demonstrated loyalty and competence were rewarded with greater responsibility and financial gain, while potential threats were neutralized through reassignment, negotiation, or subtle pressure. This careful cultivation of human capital ensured the cohesion and resilience of his network. International dimensions of Ayyub's empire required strategic acumen. Dubai and Karachi remained critical hubs for facilitating shipments to Europe and the Middle East. Merchants, financial intermediaries, and port officials were carefully nurtured to guarantee the reliability and discretion of each transaction. Shipments were coordinated with meticulous attention to timing, documentation, and contingency planning, ensuring minimal exposure to detection or interference. Ayyub's personal reputation as a reliable and discreet operator reinforced the trust and loyalty of his partners, enabling the smooth functioning of his international operations. Technological integration became increasingly important. Radios, telephones, and secure communication channels allowed for faster coordination and real-time monitoring. Ayyub combined modern tools with traditional methods, trusted couriers, tribal informants, and visual signaling, to maintain operational security while enhancing efficiency. This hybrid approach reflected his adaptability and foresight, allowing the empire to evolve alongside changing technological and enforcement landscapes without compromising security. Community engagement continued to be a pillar of strategic influence. Ayyub's philanthropic efforts, supporting schools, religious institutions, and infrastructure projects, reinforced loyalty and goodwill within his territories. Villagers and local allies often acted as informants, guides, and protectors, creating a social network that bolstered both the operational and political stability of his empire. By intertwining economic influence with social responsibility, Ayyub created a system of mutual dependence that secured loyalty and minimized the risk of betrayal. The shifting dynamics of the Taliban and other emerging factions in Afghanistan required nuanced diplomacy. As control over key regions changed hands, Ayyub negotiated access and protection, ensuring that his supply chains remained uninterrupted. His understanding of local culture, tribal customs, and political allegiances allowed him to navigate these changes deftly, maintaining both operational continuity and strategic influence. His ability to balance competing interests highlighted a rare combination of tactical brilliance and cultural intelligence. Financial operations became increasingly sophisticated. Moving the vast profits generated by his international trade required careful planning, trusted intermediaries, and discreet financial networks. Shell entities, offshore accounts, and trusted associates were employed to safeguard earnings and maintain liquidity without attracting undue attention. Ayoub's understanding of both logistics and finance allowed him to control not only the movement of product but also the flow of capital, reinforcing the stability and reach of his empire. Despite immense operational demands, Ayoub maintained a composed public persona. He avoided ostentatious displays of wealth, nurtured family and tribal ties, and projected calm authority. This measured presence reinforced trust, minimized scrutiny from authorities and rivals, and allowed him to operate with a degree of discretion unusual for a man of his stature. His reputation for fairness, reliability, and strategic foresight strengthened both his internal and external influence. Emerging threats continued to test the resilience of the empire. Rival traffickers, ambitious subordinates, and increasing international attention created an environment where every decision carried weight. Operational flexibility, rapid adaptation, and strategic intelligence became essential. Ayoub's ability to anticipate and respond to these challenges demonstrated a level of agility and foresight that few rivals could match, ensuring the continued success of his enterprise. The late 2000s also highlighted the delicate balance between expansion and stability. While opportunities for growth existed in new markets and routes, the risk of overextension was ever present. Ayoub's strategy focused on reinforcing existing networks, enhancing operational security, and maintaining influence across key territories. This measured approach allowed for continued profitability while safeguarding the integrity of the empire. The human element remained central to Ayoub's enduring influence. Lieutenants and key personnel were carefully mentored to uphold his standards of loyalty, discretion, and operational excellence. Disloyalty was quietly addressed, competence rewarded, and relationships continuously nurtured. This emphasis on trust, discipline, and accountability ensured that the network functioned effectively across diverse and challenging environments. Community integration. Operational discipline, and strategic foresight combined to create a resilient and enduring empire. Shipments moved reliably, alliances remained stable, and internal cohesion persisted despite external pressures. Ayoub's ability to navigate volatility with calm authority reinforced his dominance and protected the continuity of his operations. Yet, even in this period of apparent stability, vulnerability remained inherent. Shifting political landscapes, emerging rivals, and intensifying scrutiny meant that any lapse could have significant consequences. Ayoub's continued success relied on vigilance, adaptability, and a deep understanding of both human and geopolitical dynamics. In essence, the late 2000s represented a period of quiet consolidation, strategic adaptation, and sustained dominance for Haji Ayoub Afridi. His empire, built over decades, had evolved into a sophisticated, transnational network characterized by operational precision, strategic intelligence, and social influence. This era showcased both the heights of his power and the constant vigilance required to maintain control in a world defined by volatility, competition, and relentless scrutiny. The dawn of the 2010s marked a period of both refinement and heightened vigilance for Haji Ayoub Afridi. By this stage, his empire had endured decades of political upheaval, regional conflict, and international pressure, yet remained remarkably resilient. The geopolitical landscape of Afghanistan and Pakistan had continued to evolve, Taliban influence persisted in key areas, the central Afghan government struggled to assert authority, and Pakistan faced fluctuating internal stability. For Ayoub, these dynamics created a delicate environment in which his decisions carried profound implications. Survival and prosperity were no longer guaranteed by operational skill alone, they demanded constant foresight, adaptability, and strategic diplomacy. The logistical network that had underpinned his empire for decades continued to operate with military-like precision. Convoys transporting heroin, opium, and hashish moved under carefully planned schedules, often taking multiple alternate routes to avoid detection. Drivers, couriers, and intermediaries were highly trained, capable of responding to unexpected challenges, from law enforcement checkpoints to rival attacks. Warehouses in Karachi, Dubai, and select border regions functioned as secure nodes, each maintaining strict compartmentalization and redundancy to ensure the smooth flow of product. Every movement was calculated, every contingency accounted for, demonstrating Ayoub's mastery of both scale and detail. Political and tribal dynamics remained central to his continued dominance. Ayoub had long cultivated relationships with tribal leaders, local politicians, and regional power brokers, but the changing political climate required constant attention. As rival factions, emerging militias, and international actors exerted influence, he navigated these pressures with careful diplomacy. His reputation for fairness, discretion, and strategic intelligence allowed him to act as a mediator in disputes, ensuring both operational continuity and the stability of his territories. In doing so, Ayoub reinforced his dual role as trafficker and respected authority figure, a delicate balance that few could achieve. Internal management presented ongoing challenges. Ambitious subordinates and lieutenants occasionally tested boundaries, seeking greater autonomy or influence. Ayoub responded with a combination of mentorship, reward, and subtle enforcement. Loyalty was cultivated through profit-sharing, responsibility, and recognition, while disloyalty or recklessness was quietly addressed through reassignment, negotiation, or disciplined action. This careful attention to human capital maintained cohesion and operational integrity, ensuring that his network remained resilient even amid shifting dynamics. The international dimension of his operations demanded strategic foresight. Dubai, Karachi, and other critical hubs continued to facilitate shipments to European and Middle Eastern markets. Merchants, port authorities, and financial intermediaries were carefully selected and cultivated to guarantee reliability, discretion, and trustworthiness. Shipments were meticulously timed, with documentation and coordination designed to minimize exposure. Ayoub's personal reputation as a dependable and strategic operator reinforced the confidence of his international partners, ensuring that the global dimension of his empire remained intact despite intensifying scrutiny. Technological integration further enhanced operational efficiency. Radios, secure telecommunication channels, and emerging digital systems allowed for real-time monitoring and coordination across vast territories. Ayoub blended these innovations with traditional methods, trusted couriers, tribal informants, and local intelligence, to maintain discretion while optimizing logistics. This capacity to integrate modern tools without compromising operational security underscored his adaptability and strategic acumen. Community engagement continued to play a vital role in reinforcing loyalty and influence. Investments in schools, mosques, infrastructure, and social welfare projects strengthened ties with tribal communities and local populations. Villagers who benefited from his generosity often became allies, informants, and facilitators of his operations. By intertwining social responsibility with operational needs, Ayoub created a resilient network built on mutual dependence, trust, and respect. This social dimension not only protected his operations but also reinforced his stature as a local authority beyond the purely criminal sphere. The shifting dynamics of Afghanistan, particularly the Taliban's persistent influence and intermittent conflicts among local warlords, required continuous adaptation. Ayoub navigated these challenges with strategic diplomacy, leveraging relationships and intelligence to maintain access to key territories. His ability to anticipate changes, negotiate favorable terms, and avoid unnecessary conflict allowed him to sustain operational continuity and protect his network from destabilizing forces. Financial management remained a critical component of sustaining the empire. Profits from international trade were carefully moved through trusted intermediaries, offshore accounts, and financial networks designed to minimize detection and maximize liquidity. Ayoub's understanding of both operational logistics and financial strategy allowed him to maintain control over both product and profit, reinforcing the security and longevity of his network. The sophisticated financial infrastructure complemented his logistical empire, ensuring a stable and resilient foundation. Despite the immense operational complexity, Ayyub maintained an understated public persona. He avoided flamboyant displays of wealth, nurtured close family and tribal ties, and projected calm, measured authority. This deliberate approach reinforced trust among allies, minimized scrutiny from rivals and authorities, and allowed him to operate effectively while maintaining a low profile. His reputation for strategic intelligence, reliability, and fairness further solidified his influence and deterred challenges. The human element of the empire remained central. Lieutenants were trained to act autonomously while remaining aligned with Ayyub's broader objectives. Loyalty and competence were consistently rewarded, while threats to cohesion or operational integrity were addressed quietly but decisively. This careful cultivation of human capital allowed the empire to function smoothly, even under external pressures and internal ambitions. The late 2000s and early 2010s also underscored the delicate balance between expansion and stability. Opportunities for growth, such as new markets, transportation routes, and alliances, existed but carried risks. Ayyub focused on reinforcing established networks, maintaining operational security, and ensuring political and social influence remained intact. This measured approach allowed for continued profitability while safeguarding the core structure of the empire. Emerging threats, including rival traffickers, regional instability, and increasing international attention, demanded constant vigilance. Ayyub's ability to anticipate risks, adapt strategies, and maintain loyalty ensured that his operations remained resilient. His blend of strategic foresight, operational discipline, and social intelligence enabled him to navigate a world where volatility and opportunity coexisted in equal measure. In essence, the early 2010s marked a period of refinement, consolidation, and cautious expansion for Haji Ayyub Afridi. His empire, built over decades, had evolved into a sophisticated, transnational network characterized by operational precision, financial acumen, and social influence. This era highlighted both the peaks of his power and the ever-present need for vigilance, adaptability, and strategic intelligence in a world defined by uncertainty, competition, and relentless scrutiny. Ayyub's mastery of logistics, human networks, political negotiation, and financial strategy reinforced the durability of his empire. Yet even as he maintained dominance, the fragility inherent in shadow networks served as a constant reminder. Every alliance, shipment, and decision carried the weight of potential opportunity or peril. The early 2010s were a testament to his enduring acumen, resilience, and the quiet authority that had enabled him to survive and thrive across decades of turbulence and transformation. The mid-2010s marked a period of consolidation and careful strategy for Haji Ayyub Afridi. Having built decades of influence and a vast narcotics empire, he now focused on maintaining stability and minimizing risk rather than pursuing aggressive expansion. Political volatility in Pakistan and Taliban-controlled regions of Afghanistan required discretion, diplomacy, and constant foresight. Operational networks continued with precision. Shipments of heroin, opium, and hashish moved along rehearsed mountain routes, supported by compartmentalized warehouses in Karachi, Dubai, and border regions. Couriers and drivers were rigorously trained to respond to threats, ensuring secrecy and reliability. Political and tribal alliances remained crucial. Ayyub's reputation for fairness and strategic insight allowed him to negotiate access, prevent conflicts, and stabilize territories. Internally, seasoned lieutenants were guided with mentorship, incentives, and subtle enforcement, maintaining loyalty and cohesion without disruption. International operations relied on trusted intermediaries and secure channels, while technology gradually enhanced coordination. Community influence reinforced authority, investments in schools, religious institutions, and infrastructure fostered loyalty among local populations, creating a social buffer for his operations. The mid-2010s showcased Ayyub's ability to combine operational discipline, diplomacy, and social influence. By carefully consolidating his empire, managing human networks, and maintaining strategic foresight, He ensured that his decades-long legacy remained resilient amidst growing pressures and an increasingly complex geopolitical environment. The late 2010s were a period of reflection and cautious vigilance for Haji Ayoub Afridi. Decades of experience had solidified his influence, yet the world around him had grown increasingly volatile. Taliban control in Afghanistan, shifting political dynamics in Pakistan, and intensified international surveillance demanded discretion, careful planning, and strategic foresight. Bold expansion had given way to careful maintenance and risk management. Operational networks remained precise. Shipments of heroin, opium, and hashish traversed mountain passes along secured routes, supported by compartmentalized warehouses in Karachi, Dubai, and border regions. Couriers and drivers followed strict protocols to ensure secrecy and reliability. Political alliances with tribal elders, warlords, and regional leaders allowed Ayoub to negotiate access, stabilize territories, and prevent conflicts. Internally, lieutenants were carefully guided. Loyalty and competence were rewarded, while misalignment or ambition was quietly managed. International operations continued through trusted intermediaries, connecting his network to global markets. Community influence reinforced authority, with investments in schools, religious institutions, and local infrastructure fostering loyalty and trust among tribal populations. The late 2010s highlighted the delicate balance between preservation and adaptation. Through disciplined management, strategic diplomacy, and operational precision, Ayoub maintained his empire's cohesion and resilience. Even amid mounting pressures, his calm authority ensured that decades of influence, networks, and legacy endured, securing his place as a formidable figure in the regional narcotics world. The early 2020s were a period of reflection and careful management for Haji Ayoub Afridi. Decades of empire building had made him a legendary figure, yet the world had grown increasingly volatile. Taliban control in Afghanistan remained strong, regional politics in Pakistan shifted unpredictably, and global law enforcement intensified surveillance on narcotics networks. Survival now depended not only on operational skill but on discretion, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. His logistics network remained precise. Shipments of heroin, opium, and hashish traversed mountain passes using carefully planned routes and trained couriers. Warehouses in Karachi, Dubai, and border regions operated under strict compartmentalization, ensuring resilience even under risk. Each movement reflected decades of operational mastery. Political and tribal dynamics required constant attention. Ayoub's long-standing relationships with tribal elders, warlords, and regional officials allowed him to negotiate access, prevent conflicts, and stabilize his operations. Internal management remained delicate, seasoned lieutenants were guided with mentorship, rewards, and discreet enforcement to maintain loyalty and cohesion. International operations continued through key hubs like Dubai and Karachi. Merchants and intermediaries were carefully vetted, while financial flows moved through secure and discreet channels. Technology enhanced coordination, combining encrypted communication with trusted human networks. Community influence also remained central. Investments in education, religious institutions, and infrastructure reinforced loyalty, providing a social buffer that protected operational integrity. By combining operational precision, diplomacy, and social influence, Ayoub preserved his empire's resilience, adapting to a world of heightened scrutiny while ensuring his legacy endured. By the mid-2020s, Haji Ayoub Afridi's empire had matured into a highly sophisticated network, but new pressures tested its resilience. Rival factions, regional instability, and international law enforcement intensified risks, demanding constant vigilance and adaptability. Age and experience made Ayoub more cautious, focusing on preserving stability rather than bold expansion. Operational networks remained finely tuned. Convoys followed secured routes, warehouses functioned under compartmentalized systems, and couriers were trained to respond quickly to unforeseen challenges. Political alliances with tribal elders, warlords, and local authorities ensured access to strategic territories while minimizing conflict. Internally, lieutenants with growing influence were carefully managed. Loyalty and competence were rewarded, while threats were neutralized quietly. This balance of discipline and delegation preserved cohesion, allowing operations to continue efficiently under increasing external scrutiny. Internationally, Dubai and Karachi remained critical hubs. Merchants, port officials, and financial intermediaries were selected for reliability and discretion, allowing global shipments to flow with minimal risk. Technology, including secure communications and digital tracking, integrated with traditional networks to enhance coordination. Ayyub also maintained his community influence, funding schools, mosques, and local welfare initiatives. Villagers and tribal allies provided both loyalty and operational support. Social influence combined with strategic control reinforced the durability of his empire. The mid-2020s reflected a period of careful preservation. Ayyub's operational discipline, political intelligence, and social networks allowed him to navigate volatility effectively. His focus on consolidation, cautious adaptation, and loyalty ensured the resilience of an empire built over decades, sustaining both influence and legacy in a rapidly changing world. The late 2020s marked the final chapter of Haji Ayyub Afridi's empire. By now, he was a master of discretion, strategy, and influence. Bold expansion had given way to careful preservation, as geopolitical volatility, rising rivals, and global scrutiny made prudence essential. His focus shifted toward maintaining cohesion, protecting assets, and securing a lasting legacy. Operational networks continued with precision. Shipments moved through trusted couriers and secure warehouses in Karachi, Dubai, and border regions. Encrypted communications and traditional tribal intelligence worked in tandem, ensuring the continuity of operations while minimizing risk. Political alliances remained critical, with tribal leaders and warlords providing access and stability, while internal management maintained loyalty among seasoned lieutenants. International networks were carefully maintained, with merchants, port authorities, and financial intermediaries selected for discretion and reliability. Technology integrated with experience to coordinate shipments, manage risks, and preserve efficiency. Community influence continued to reinforce his authority. Investments in infrastructure, education, and religious institutions created loyal allies and a social buffer, protecting operational networks and enhancing his reputation. The late 2020s were defined by strategic reflection and subtle diplomacy. Ayyub focused on succession planning, preserving influence, and reinforcing the systems that had sustained his empire. His legacy became as much about careful stewardship and human intelligence as it was about operational skill. Haji Ayyub Afridi's enduring mastery of logistics, finance, political negotiation, and social networks ensured the resilience of his empire. Even amid rising pressures, his calm authority, strategic foresight, and disciplined management allowed his influence to persist, leaving a legacy that would endure long beyond his active years, cementing his place as one of the most formidable figures in the history of regional organized crime.